Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I never thought I'd be afraid of the dark again, not since I was a kid, but ever since Jake moved in the shadows in our apartment have felt different, alive almost. And I can't shake the feeling that they're watching me. It all started about 3 months ago. I'd put up an ad for a roommate after my last one moved out to live with her boyfriend. The rent in the city was getting ridiculous, and I couldn't afford the place on my own. Jake seemed normal enough when he answered the ad. Clean cut, steady job, raw, and a quiet demeanor, just what I was looking for. The first few weeks were fine. We'd pass each other in the hallway, exchange pleasantries about work or the weather, and go about our lives. I barely noticed him most of the time, which was perfect. I'd had my fair share of nightmare roommates in college, and I was glad to have someone who kept to himself. But then things started to change. It was subtle at first, so subtle that I almost didn't notice. A coffee mug out of place here, a door left slightly ajar there. Nothing major, just little things that made me pause and think, didn't I? Before shrugging it off, I started waking up in the middle of the night more often. At first I blamed it on stress from work, but then I began to hear things, soft footsteps in the hallway, the creak of a floorboard, whispers so faint I could almost convince myself I was imagining them. Almost one night, I woke up around 4 a.m. parched. As I padded to the kitchen for a glass of water, I noticed Jake's door was open a crack. I paused, listening. There was a low murmur coming from inside, like he was talking to someone, but I hadn't heard anyone come in, and Jake never had visitors, especially not this late. I leaned closer, trying to make out the words. The murmuring stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it made my ears ring. I held my breath, suddenly aware of how loud my heartbeat sounded in the quiet apartment. After a moment, I heard movement inside the room, and I quickly retreated to the kitchen, my thirst forgotten. The next morning, Jake was his usual self, nodding a greeting as he grabbed his travel mug of coffee. Before heading out, I wanted to ask him about the night before, but something held me back. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe he was on the phone or watching a video with headphones. There had to be a logical explanation, but the incidents kept piling up. I'd come home to find things moved around in the living room, despite Jake insisting he hadn't been in there. My favorite sweater vanished from my closet, only to reappear a week later, smelling faintly of something I couldn't quite place, and the whispers, they were getting louder. I started spending more time out of the apartment, making excuses to stay late at work or meet friends for dinner, anything to avoid being alone with Jake and the growing sense of unease that permeated our shared space. But I couldn't avoid it forever. One Friday night, I came home late after drinks with coworkers. The apartment was dark, and I assumed Jake was already in bed. I kicked off my shoes and made my way to my room, the alcohol making my steps a little less steady than usual. As I passed Jake's room, I noticed something odd. His door was wide open, but the room beyond was pitch black, not even the glow of a phone or laptop screen, just darkness. I paused, squinting into the void. Was he even in there? Jake, I called softly, not wanting to wake him if he was asleep. No response. I took a step closer, my hand reaching for the light switch. Just as my fingers brushed against it, I heard a sound from inside the room, a low guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't sound human. I yanked my hand back and stumbled away from the door, my heart pounding. What the hell was that? I retreated to my room, locking the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I woke up late, my head pounding from the combination of alcohol and lack of sleep. I shuffled to the kitchen, desperately in need of coffee, and aspirin Jake was already there calmly eating a bowl of cereal at the counter. Rough night, he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. I grunted in response, not trusting myself to speak. As I reached for the coffee pot, I noticed a scratch on my arm that hadn't been there the night before. 4 parallel lines. Like claw marks, my blood ran cold. Everything okay? Jake's voice came from right behind me, making me jump. I hadn't heard him move. Fine, I managed to croak out. Must have scratched myself in my sleep. Jake nodded, but his eyes lingered on the marks. There was something in his expression. I couldn't quite read concern, amusement, or something else entirely. From that day on, I felt like I was losing my mind. Objects would disappear and reappear in impossible places. I'd wake up to find muddy footprints leading from the front door to Jake's room, despite it not having rained in weeks. And the whispers, they were constant. Now a low hum just at the edge of my hearing. I tried to talk to Jake about it, to ask if he'd noticed anything strange, but every time I brought it up, he changed the subject or suddenly remember an urgent errand. It was like he was avoiding the topic or avoiding me. Things came to a head about a week ago. I'd been tossing and turning all night, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. Around 3 a.m. I heard a thud from the living room, followed by the sound of breaking glass. My heart racing, I got out of bed and crept to my door. I could hear movement outside, shuffling footsteps, and what sounded like dragging. Taking a deep breath, I opened my door and peered out into the hallway. The living room was dark, but I could make out a figure hunched over near the bookshelf. It was too tall to be Jake, its limbs too long and bent at odd angles. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't touching the floor. It was floating ever so slightly above the ground. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, I'm not sure, because the figure suddenly went still. Then slowly it began to turn towards me. I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes, too many eyes, before I slammed my door shut and locked it, my hand shaking so badly I could barely manage the deadbolt. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of my room, a kitchen knife clutched in my trembling hands. When morning finally came, I burst out of my room, half expecting to find the living room in shambles. But everything was normal. The bookshelf was intact, no broken glass, no sign of any disturbance. Jake was in the kitchen making toast. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. Sleep? While he asked casually, as if he hadn't heard the commotion in the night. I opened my mouth to confront him, to demand answers about what the hell was going on in our apartment, but the words died in my throat as I noticed something behind him, his shadow on the wall. It didn't match his movements. As Jake reached for the butter, his shadow's arm stretched impossibly long, its fingers elongating into sharp claws. I blinked, and the shadow was normal again. Jake was looking at me, expectantly waiting for an answer. I need to go, I stammered, backing away. I'm going to stay with a friend for a few days. Jake's expression didn't change, but I swore I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Disappointment, hunger, of course, he said smoothly. Take all the time you need. I packed a bag in record time, not even bothering to shower or change. As I headed for the door, Jake called out from the kitchen, don't forget rent's due next week. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. I turned to look at him, really look at him. For the first time in weeks he smiled, and for a split second I saw too many teeth, sharp and gleaming. I ran. That was 3 days ago. I've been crashing on a friend's couch trying to figure out what to do. I can't go back there, not with whatever Jake is, but I can't afford to break the lease, and all my stuff is still in the apartment. Last night I got a text from an unknown number. It was a picture of my bedroom taken from the doorway. The message below it read, "We miss you. When are you coming home? I'm writing this now from a 24-hour diner." My third cup of coffee growing cold in front of me. I don't know what to do. I don't know if anyone will believe me. All I know is that I can't go back to that apartment. Not now, not ever. But as I sit here, I can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me. And when I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the diner's window, I could have sworn I saw a familiar figure standing behind me smiling with too many teeth. I think Jake's found me. And I don't think he's going to let me leave again. The first time I saw him, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, a shadow among the trees. But as the days went on, and the figure kept appearing at the edge of my vision, I realized with growing dread that I wasn't alone out here, and whatever was watching me, it wasn't human. I've always been an avid hiker and camper. There's something about being alone in nature that centers me, helps me clear my head. So when things at work started getting stressful, I decided to take a week off for a solo backpacking trip, just me, the wilderness, and my thoughts. The trail I chose was pretty remote, a 50 loop through dense forest and rocky terrain. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, but never one this long or isolated. Still, I felt prepared. I had all the right gear, plenty of supplies, and years of experience under my belt. The first 2 days were perfect. The weather was crisp but sunny, the trail challenging but manageable. I set up camp each night in small clearings, falling asleep to the sound of wind in the trees and distant owl calls. It was exactly what I needed to decompress. On the third day, things started to change. I was about halfway through my hike, deep in the heart of the forest. The trees were older here, massive trunks stretching up into a canopy so thick it blocked out most of the sunlight. The trail narrowed, winding between gnarled roots and moss-covered rocks. That's when I first saw him, just a glimpse, and really a dark figure standing between two distant trees, barely visible in the gloom. I blinked, and it was gone. I chalked it up to my eyes playing tricks on me in the low light, and kept walking. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The back of my neck prickled, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. A couple of times I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time I set up camp that night, my nerves were frayed. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just the isolation getting to me. But as I sat by my small campfire, I couldn't help but stare into the darkness beyond the ring of light, searching for something. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake. My heart pounding. The fire had died down to embers, casting eerie shadows across the clearing, and there, just at the edge of the tree line, I saw it again, a figure tall and unnaturally still, watching me. I scrambled for my flashlight, my hand shaking as I flicked it on and pointed it towards where I'd seen the figure. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing, just trees and underbrush. I swept the light back and forth, my breath coming in short gasps. But there was no sign of anyone or anything out there. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay in my tent, every snapping twig or rustling leaf making me flinch. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. Whatever I'd seen, it wasn't natural. The next morning, I seriously considered cutting my trip short and heading back, but the quickest way out was to continue forward. Backtracking would add an extra day to my journey. So I packed up camp and hit the trail, constantly scanning my surroundings as I walked forward. Most of the day things were quiet, too quiet actually. I realized I couldn't hear any birds or small animals, which was unusual for this time of year. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the sun began to set, I started looking for a place to make camp. That's when I saw it again, the figure standing maybe 100 yards ahead on the trail. This time, I got a better look at it. It was tall, much taller than any person I'd ever seen, with limbs that seemed too long and thin. Its skin, what I could see of it, was pale and almost bark-like in texture. I froze, my blood turning to ice. in my veins. The figure didn't move, it didn't make a sound, it just stood there watching me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in a silent standoff. Then slowly it took a step backwards and melted into the shadows between the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. I made camp in a small cave I found just off the trail, feeling a little safer with solid rock at my back, but I couldn't shake the image of that thing from my mind. The way it moved, the otherworldly stillness of it, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. As I sat there in the dark, my mind racing, I started to hear things, whispers on the wind, too faint to make out words. But definitely they're the sound of footsteps circling my campsite, drawing closer, and then fading away again. Once, I could have sworn I heard breathing right outside the cave entrance, deep and ragged. When dawn finally broke, I was a wreck, exhausted, paranoid, jumping at every sound. But I knew I couldn't stay in the cave forever. I had to keep moving, had to get back to civilization. So I packed up my gear with shaking hands and set out, my eyes constantly darting from side to side. As I walked, the day passed in a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. I saw the figure several more times, always at a distance, always just watching. Sometimes it would be standing on the trail ahead of me, other times I'd catch a glimpse of it moving through the trees parallel to my path. It never tried to approach me directly, but it was always there, always watching. By the time night fell again, I was nearing the end of my rope. I knew I should stop and make camp, but the thought of spending another night out here with that thing lurking in the darkness was unbearable. So I kept walking, using my flashlight to illuminate the trail ahead. That's when things took a turn for the worse. My flashlight started to flicker, the beam growing weaker and weaker. I changed the batteries, but it didn't help. Within minutes, I was plunged into total darkness. I stood there on the trail, paralyzed with fear. The forest around me seemed to come alive with sounds, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer. In a panic, I left the trail, stumbling blindly through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, and arms' roots threatened to trip me with every step. But I kept going. I had to get away, had to find somewhere to hide. I don't know how long I ran, or in what direction. All I knew was that the footsteps were getting closer, no matter how fast I moved. Finally, I collapsed against a large tree, my lungs burning, my legs shaking with exhaustion. As I stood there trying to catch my breath, I realized I could no longer hear the footsteps. The forest had gone completely silent for a moment. I dared to hope that I'd lost whatever was chasing me. Then I heard it, a sound so soft I almost missed it, the sound of fabric moving against bark coming from right above me. Slowly dreading what I might see, I looked up. There, perched on a branch just a few feet above my head, was the figure. In the dim moonlight filtering through the leaves, I could finally see it clearly. Its body was twisted, and elongated limbs bent at impossible angles as it clung to the tree. Its skin was a patchwork of bark and pale flesh stretching tight over a too thin frame. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Where eyes should have been, there were only dark, empty sockets. Its mouth was a gash across its face, stretching from ear to ear, filled with jagged thorn-like teeth. As I watched, frozen in terror, that mouth began to open wider and wider until it seemed to split the creature's head in half. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or safety. Branches tore at my clothes, and skin, roots, and rocks threatened to send me sprawling. But I didn't slow down. I could hear it behind me, moving through the trees with inhuman speed and grace. I don't know how I found my way back to the trail, blind luck maybe, or some long-buried survival instinct, but suddenly I burst out of the trees onto the packed dirt path. In the distance, I could see lights, a ranger station, or maybe a campground. I sprinted towards those lights, not daring to look back. As I ran, I could hear it in the trees, beside me keeping pace, but it didn't leave the forest, didn't step out onto the open trail. When I finally reached the lights, a small ranger outpost, as it turned out, I was a mess covered in scratches and bruises, clothes torn, babbling about monsters in the woods. The rangers were kind but skeptical. They assumed I'd gotten lost and panicked, maybe eaten some bad berries that made me hallucinate. I didn't argue. How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd experienced? They'd never believe me. Hell, part of me didn't want to believe it myself. It's been 2 weeks since I got back from that trip. I've tried to put it behind me, to convince myself it was all in my head, but sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear whispers on the wind, and once, just once, I thought I saw a tall, thin figure standing at the edge of the woods behind my house. I don't go hiking anymore, and I never ever camp alone. The neon open sign flickered in the rearview mirror as I pulled away from Joe's Pizza, the warmth of the pie box on the passenger seat, a sharp contrast to the chill creeping up my spine. I should have known better than to take a delivery this far out, especially this late. But the tip promised was too good to pass up now. As the houses grew sparse and the road darker, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake. I've been delivering pizzas for about 6 months now. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills while I finish up my degree. Most nights are pretty routine: suburban homes, college dorms, the occasional office, working late. But this delivery was different from the start. The address came in just as I was about to clock out. 60 Oakwood Lane. It was way out on the edge of our delivery zone, almost to the point where I'd have argued it was too far. But the customer had offered a $50 tip on top of the order, and my manager practically shoved me out the door with the pie. As I drove, the city lights faded behind me, replaced by the oppressive darkness of the countryside. The GPS on my phone guided me down increasingly narrow and poorly maintained roads. I started to wonder if I'd missed a turn somewhere when I finally saw it, a dirt driveway barely visible in the gloom, marked only by a rusted mailbox with the number 55 barely legible. I pulled in my headlights, illuminating a path that wound through dense woods. The trees seemed to close and around me, branches scraping against the sides of my car. After what felt like an eternity, the driveway opened up into a small clearing, and there, bathed in the pale moonlight, stood the house. It was old, the kind of place that might have been grand once, but had long since fallen into disrepair. Paint peeled from weathered clavers, and several windows were boarded up. There was a truck parked off to the side, but it looked like it hadn't moved in years, weeds growing up around the tires. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, debating whether to just turn around and leave, but $50 was $50, and I'd already come all this way. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the pizza and got out of the car. The porch steps creaked ominously under my feet as I approached the front door. There was no doorbell, so I knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Hello, I called out. Pizza delivery. Still nothing. I was just about to give up and head back to my car when I heard a movement inside the house, footsteps slow and deliberate. Approaching the door, the porch light flickered to life, momentarily blinding me. The door opened with a groan, revealing a man who looked to be in his mid-50s. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scraggly beard and eyes that seemed to bore right through me. Behind him, I could make out 2 other men hovering in the shadow of what looked like a sparsely furnished living room. A pizza for Daniel, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man in the doorway just stared at me, his expression unreadable. After an uncomfortably long pause, he spoke, his voice low and growly. We didn't order any pizza. I blinked, confused. But this is 55 Oakwood Lane, right? He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. Then there must be some mistake, I said, fumbling for my phone to check the order details. The order came in about 30 minutes ago, I said. He interrupted, his tone hardening. We didn't order any pizza. That's when I noticed the other two men had moved closer. They were both younger than the first guy, but just as imposing. One was wearing a dirty wife beater, his arms covered in crude tattoos. The other had on a flannel shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Okay, no problem," I said, taking a step back. "Sorry for the mix-up. I'll just head back and sort this out." I turned to leave, but the man's next words stopped me cold. "What are you really doing here, boy?" I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. "What do you mean? I'm just delivering a pizza." The man took a step onto the porch, forcing me to back up further. "No one delivers out here, especially not at this hour. So I'll ask you again, what are you really doing here?" "I swear I'm just a delivery driver," I stammered, holding up the pizza box like a shield. "Look, I've got the uniform and everything. This is all just a misunderstanding." The tattooed guy snorted. "Yeah, right, a misunderstanding. You hear that, boys? We got ourselves a comedian." The man in the flannel stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Maybe we ought to teach him. It ain't nice to lie." I felt the blood drain from my face. This was bad, really bad. I needed to get out of there fast. "Listen, I'm sorry for bothering you," I said, backing towards the steps. "I'll just go, okay? Forget this ever happened." But as I turned to hurry down the stairs, I found my path blocked. Another man, this one older and leaner than the others, had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He stood at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, a wicked-looking knife glinting in his hand. "Going somewhere?" he asked, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I spun back around only to find the other three men had moved to surround me. The first guy, clearly the leader, leaned in close. I could smell stale cigarettes and whiskey on his breath. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're going to tell us who sent you and why, and then, if we're feeling generous, we might let you leave here in one piece. Understand?" I nodded frantically, my mind racing. "Please, you've got it all wrong. I'm just a college student working a part-time job. I don't know anything about whatever it is you think is going on here." The leader exchanged glances with the others, then turned back to me with a sigh. "Wrong answer, kid." He nodded to the guy with the knife, who started up the steps. I backed away, bumping into the porch railing. My eyes darted around, looking for any way out, but I was completely boxed, and just as I was about to make a desperate lunge for freedom, headlights swept across the front of the house. We all turned to look as a car pulled into the driveway, an old station wagon I recognized as belonging to my coworker Mike. Mike got out of the car, another pizza box in hand. He looked confused as he took in the scene on the porch. "A delivery for 55 Oakwood Lane," he called out hesitantly. The leader's eyes narrowed as he looked from Mike back to me. "What the hell is this?" I saw my chance and took it. "See, I told you it was just a mix-up with the orders. 2 deliveries got sent to the same address by mistake." Mike, bless his clueless soul, started walking towards the house. "Yes, sorry about that, folks. Our system's been glitchy lately. We can give you a discount if you want both pizzas." The leader held up a hand, silencing Mike. He studied me for a long moment, then let out a bark of laughter. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like you were telling the truth." After all, kid, the tension on the porch seemed to deflate. All at once, the guy with the knife tucked it away, and the others stepped back, giving me some space. "Honest mistake," the leader said, clapping me on the shoulder hard enough to make me wince. "No hard feelings, right?" I nodded, weakly, relief washing over me. "Or right, no hard feelings." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash, peeling off several bills. "Here for your trouble, both of you." He handed me $100, then tossed another 100 to Mike, who caught it with a surprised grin. "Now get on out of here," the leader said, his tone friendly but with an undercurrent of steel. "And maybe don't mention this little misunderstanding to anyone." "Yeah?" I didn't need to be told twice. I practically ran down the steps, grabbing a very confused Mike by the arm and dragging him back to our cars. "Dude, what the hell was?" Mike asked as we got in our vehicles. "Just a mix-up," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Let's get out of here. As we drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the men following us. But the road behind us remained dark and empty. I quit my job at the pizza place the next day. No amount of tips was worth going through something like that again. Sometimes late at night I still think about those men and that isolated house in the woods. I don't know what they were up to out there, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never make another delivery to 55 Oakwood Lane. Some addresses are better left unvisited. The moment I realized we were going the wrong way, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the late night air conditioning in the taxi. I'd taken this route home countless times, but the unfamiliar streets stretching out before us told me we were headed somewhere I'd never been, and judging by the cold, calculating look in the driver's eyes as they met mine in the rear-view mirror, I had a sinking feeling this wasn't a simple mistake. It was supposed to be just another Friday night, a few drinks with friends, maybe some dancing, then a quick cab ride home to collapse into bed. Nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. The bar had been packed, the music too loud, but the company was good, and the drinks kept flowing. By the time we called it a night, I was pleasantly buzzed, but not drunk, just tired and ready to be home. I remember stepping out of the bar, the cool night air, a refreshing change from the stuffy interior. My friends headed off in different directions, some to nearby apartments, others to the subway station a block away. I looked around for a taxi, spotting one idling at the curb not far from where I stood. The driver nodded as I approached, unlocking the doors with a soft click. I slid into the back seat, rattling off my address. As I buckled up, he grunted in acknowledgement, pulling away from the curb and merging into the late-night traffic. At first, everything seemed normal. We headed down familiar streets, the city lights blurring past the windows. I leaned my head back, letting the gentle motion of the car lull me into a light doze. It wasn't until I noticed the absence of the usual landmarks that I started to pay attention to our route. Excuse me, I said, leaning forward slightly. I think you might have taken a wrong turn. We should have passed the park by now. The driver's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting mine for a brief moment before returning to the road shortcut. He grunted, less traffic this way. I frowned, glancing out the window. The buildings here were different, older, more industrial, not the kind of area I was used to seeing on my way home. I don't think this is right. Could you please turn around? He didn't respond, just kept driving. The streets were getting narrower, darker. The few street lights we passed cast eerie shadows across crumbling brick walls and boarded up storefronts. My heart began to race, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. Hey, I said, my voice sharper now. I said, turn around, this isn't the way to my house. The driver's eyes met mine in the mirror again, and this time I saw something in them that made my blood run cold. There was no warmth there, no reassurance, just a calculating, predatory gleam that told me this was no accident. I were almost there, he said, his voice low and emotionless. I felt my breath catch in my throat, almost where this isn't where I asked to go. He didn't answer, just kept driving. I tried the door handle, but it was locked, of course. I fumbled for my phone, cursing under my breath. When I saw there was no signal, we must have been in some kind of dead zone. Let me out, I demanded, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Stop the car right now and let me out. The driver chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. Can't do that, we've got a ways to go yet. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I could try breaking the window, but even if I managed it, we were moving too fast for me to jump out safely. And who knew where we were, or if there was anyone around to help if I did escape? I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Maybe I could reason with him. Look, I don't know what you want, but this isn't right. I've got money, not much, but it's yours if you just turn around and take me home. He shook his head slowly. It's not about money. Those words sent a chill through me. If it wasn't about money, what did he want? My imagination conjured up a dozen terrifying scenarios, each worse than the last. We drove on in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The buildings grew more sparse, giving way to empty lots and abandoned warehouses. I kept my eyes glued to the passing scenery, desperately trying to spot any landmarks, any signs that might tell me where we were. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the car began to slow. We turned down a narrow alley, barely wide enough for the taxi to fit through. My heart pounded in my chest as we came to a stop in front of a nondescript metal door set into the side of a dilapidated brick building. The driver turned off the engine and twisted in his seat to face me. In the dim light filtering in from a distant street lamp, his features looked gaunt, almost skull-like. "We're here," he said, his voice flat. I pressed myself back against the seat as far away from him as I could get. "Where is here? What do you want from me?" He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to my surprise, he reached over and unlocked the doors. "Get out," he said. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. This had to be a trick, right? He wouldn't just let me go after bringing me all this way. But as the seconds ticked by, and he made no move to stop me, I realized this might be my only chance. Slowly, cautiously, I opened the door and stepped out of the taxi. The alley was dark and quiet, the only sound the faint hum of distant traffic. I backed away from the car, keeping my eyes on the driver. He watched me go, still sitting behind the wheel. Just as I was about to turn and run, he spoke again. "You're lucky," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You're not the one they wanted." Before I could process what he meant, he put the car in reverse and backed out of the alley, leaving me alone in the darkness. I stood there for a moment, frozen in shock, and as the reality of my situation set in, I started to run. I ran without any real sense of direction, just trying to put as much distance between myself and that alley as possible. The streets were a maze of shadows and unfamiliar turns, but I didn't dare stop. Every sound, a car in the distance, a dog barking, the rustle of wind through scattered trash, sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through me. After what felt like miles, I finally spotted a main road up ahead. As I burst out onto the better lit street, I saw a convenience store on the corner, its fluorescent lights a beacon of normalcy in the night. I practically fell through the door, startling the bored-looking clerk behind me. "Counter, please," I gasped, out of breath and probably looking like a madam. "I need to use your phone. I need to call the police." The clerk, to his credit, didn't ask questions. He handed Ed over the store phone, and I dialed 911 with shaking fingers. As I waited for someone to pick up, I glanced out the store windows, half expecting to see the taxi pulling up outside, but the street remained empty. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. I gave them my statement, trying to recall every detail I could about the driver and the route we'd taken. They were sympathetic but skeptical. Without any real evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do beyond taking me home and filing a report. As we drove back to my apartment in the patrol car, I couldn't shake the driver's final words from my mind. "You're not the one they wanted." Who were they? And who had they wanted instead of me? The implications were terrifying. In the days that followed, I scoured news reports and looking for any stories of missing persons or similar incidents, but there was nothing like. In the city went on as if nothing had happened, but for me everything had changed. I don't take taxis anymore. I don't go out alone at night. And I'm always aware of my surroundings, because I know now that there are predators out there hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment to strike. And next time, I might not be so lucky as to be the wrong target. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the hum of an engine outside my window, and in my nightmares I'm back in that taxi, driving endlessly through dark and unfamiliar streets, never knowing where I'll end up. or who's really behind the wheel. The key felt heavy in my hand as I stood before the weathered front door, its peeling paint a testament to years of neglect. I never expected to inherit a house, let alone one with such a flamboyant presence. But here I was about to step into my great-uncle's old farmhouse, blissfully unaware that I was also stepping into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. I'd only met my great-uncle Harold a handful of times at family reunions. When I was a kid, he was always the quiet one, lurking at the edges of gatherings, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching everyone with those piercing blue eyes. When I heard he passed away and left me his property, I was shocked. I didn't even know he owned a farmhouse, let alone why he'd leave it to me of all people. But hey, free house, right? I'd been struggling to make rent in the city, drowning in student loans and a dead-end job. This seemed like a golden opportunity for a fresh start. So I packed up my meager belongings, quit my job, and set out for the rural town where my great-uncle had spent his final years. The drive took most of the day, the cityscape gradually giving way to rolling hills and vast stretches of farmland. By the time I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the property, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the overgrown fields. The house itself was, well, fixer-upper would be a kind way to put it. 2 stories of faded white clapboard, a sagging porch, and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. But it was mine, and that counted for something. I took a deep breath and inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a reluctant groan, as if the house itself was protesting my intrusion. The door swung open, revealing a musty interior dimly lit by the fading daylight filtering through grimy windows. Home sweet home, I muttered, stepping inside and flicking on the lights. To my surprise, they actually worked, filling the room with a warm yellow glow that did little to dispel the overall gloom of the place. The interior was like stepping back in time. Faded floral wallpaper, furniture draped in dusty sheets, and the lingering scent of mothballs and old books. I spent the first evening exploring, opening creaky doors and peering into cobweb-filled corners. Despite its rundown state, I could see the potential with some work. This could be a cozy place to live. It wasn't until I was settling into bed that night in what I assumed had been my great-uncle's room that I first noticed something off. As I was drifting off to sleep, I could have sworn I heard footsteps in the hallway outside, soft shuffling steps that paused outside my door before continuing on. I sat up, heart racing, and listened intently. But there was nothing but silence, just my imagination. I told myself, old houses make noise, right? It's probably just the pipes or the wood settling. The next few days were a flurry of activity as I cleaned, unpacked, and started making plans for renovations. I met a few of the neighbors, mostly older folks who'd known my great-uncle. They were polite enough, but there was something in their manner that seemed guarded, like they were holding something back. It was Mrs. Hendrick from down the road who first hinted at the house's history. She stopped by with a welcome basket full of homemade preserves, and we got to chatting on the porch. It's good to see someone living in the old place again, she said, her eyes darting to the upper windows. It's been empty for so long, ever since she trailed off, and I raised an eyebrow. Ever since what? Mrs. Hendrick pursed her lips, clearly debating whether to continue. Finally she sighed. Well, I suppose you ought to know. There was an incident about 40 years back. Your great-uncle's family, his wife, and 2 kids, they disappeared, just vanished one night. No trace of them was ever found. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm afternoon sun. Disappeared? What do you mean? She shook her head. Nobody knows for sure. There was an investigation, of course, but they never turned up anything. Your uncle, he was the prime suspect for a while, but they couldn't prove anything. He lived here alone after that, hardly ever left the property. Folks around here, well, they tend to avoid this place, say it's cursed. I laughed, but it sounded hollow, even to my own ears. Curse, come on, that's just superstition. Mrs. Hendrick gave me a long look. Maybe so, but there's been talk over the years, strange noises coming from the house at night, lights in the windows. When your uncle was known to be out of town, I'm not saying I believe in ghosts or anything, but well, just be careful is all she left. Soon after leaving me with a basket of preserves and a head full of unsettling thought, that night as I lay in bed, every creak and groan of the old house seemed magnified. I found myself straining to hear those phantom footsteps again, both dreading and half expecting them. It was nearly a week later when things really started to get weird. I'd been working on clearing out the attic, sorting through boxes of old junk and fan mementos. As I was shifting a heavy trunk, something caught my eye, a small door almost hidden behind years of accumulated clutter. Curious, I cleared away the boxes and tried the handle. It was locked, but a bit of jimmying with a screwdriver popped it open. Beyond was a small, dark space, some kind of crawl space or hidden room. I shone my flashlight inside, revealing walls covered in what looked like writing. As I leaned closer, I realized with a start that it wasn't writing at all, but names, hundreds of names scrawled in what looked like charcoal, covering every inch of the walls and ceiling, and they're right in the center of the far wall were three names that made my blood run cold: Evelyn Thomas and Sarah, my great uncle's missing family. I scrambled out of the attic, my heart pounding. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? But as I paced the hallway trying to calm down, I heard it again. Those soft shuffling footsteps, only this time they were coming from the attic. I froze, staring up at the ceiling. The footsteps moved slowly, deliberately crossing the attic floor, and then starting down the stairs. Panic gripped me. I ran for the front door, fumbling with the lock, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The footsteps grew closer, reaching the second floor landing, and then I heard something that turned my blood to ice. A child's laugh followed by a woman's voice. Harold, is that you, dear? I backed away from the stairs, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Ghosts weren't real. This was just some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and Mrs. Hendrick's stories. But as I watched, three figures began to materialize at the top of the stairs, a woman in a faded dress and two children, a boy and a girl. Their forms were translucent, flickering like old film, but undeniably there. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and her expression shifted from hope to confusion to anger. You're not Harold, she said, her voice echoing strangely. Where is he? What have you done with him? I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The ghostly family began to descend the stairs, their movements jerky and unnatural. The children's faces were blank, emotionless, but the woman's was contorted with rage. He promised he'd come back for us, she hissed. He promised we'd be together again. Where is he? As they reached the bottom of the stairs, I finally found my voice. He's dead, I croaked. My great Uncle Harold, he died, that's why I'm here. I inherited the house. The woman stopped, her form flickering more intensely. Dead, she whispered, then her face twisted into a grotesque smile. Good, then he can join us. And so can you. She lunged forward, her ghostly hands reaching for my throat. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and falling hard on the floor as the spectral family closed in around me, their forms growing more solid, more menacing. I squeezed my eyes shut and screamed, and then nothing. When I opened my eyes, the hallway was empty. No ghosts, no sounds, just the quiet creaking of the old house. I didn't wait around to see if they'd come back. I grabbed my keys and ran, not even bothering to lock up behind me. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I was back in the city, safe in my old apartment that I thankfully hadn't given up yet. I never went back to that farmhouse. I hired a lawyer to deal with selling the property, telling him to get whatever price he could. I didn't care about the money, I just wanted to be rid of it. Sometimes late at night, I still hear those shuffling footsteps in my dreams. and I wonder about my great Uncle Harold, what really happened to his family, and what dark secrets he took to his grave. But mostly I'm just grateful I made it out of that house alive. Some inheritances, it turns out, are better left unclaimed. The moment his calloused hand touched my arm, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The gas station, once a beacon of hope on this desolate stretch of highway, now felt like a trap, and as his grip tightened, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold, I realized that this seemingly routine pit stop might be the last one I ever made. It had been a long day. On the road, I was driving back from visiting my sister in the next state over a trip I'd made dozens of times before. Usually, I timed it better, making sure to fill up in the busier towns where the gas stations were well lit and always had a few people milling about, but I'd gotten a late start, and now here I was, my gas light blinking insistently as the sun dipped below the horizon. When I saw the sign for Joe's Gas and Go, I breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't much, just a small convenience store with two ancient pumps out front, but it was the first sign of civilization I'd seen in miles. I pulled in, the gravel crunching under my tires. As I parked next to one of the pumps, the place looked deserted. There was a beat-up pickup truck parked on the side of the building, but other than that, no signs of life. Still, the open sign was lit, so I figured someone had to be around. I got out of my car and started to pump the gas. That's when I first noticed him. He was leaning against the side of the building, partially hidden in the shadows, just standing, their hands in his pockets, watching me. I tried to ignore the prickle of unease that ran down my spine. Probably just the owner or an employee on a smoke break, I told myself, but as I finished filling up and replaced the nozzle, I could feel his eyes on me. I risked a glance in his direction and saw that he had moved closer, now standing near the edge of the building. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a weathered face and a scraggly beard. His clothes were dirty, like he'd been working outside all day. I took a deep breath and headed into the store to pay. The bell above the door jangled as I entered, but there was no one behind the counter. "Hello," I called out. No response. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. That's when I heard the door open behind me. I turned to see the man from outside entering the store up close. Oh, he looked even more intimidating. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could crush walnuts. "You need help with something?" he asked, his voice graveling. I swallowed hard. Yeah, I need to pay for my gas. Is there someone working here?" He moved behind the counter, never taking his eyes off me. That'd be me. $32.50. I fumbled in my purse for my wallet, acutely aware of his gaze. As I handed over the cash, his fingers brushed against mine, lingering a moment too long. I suppressed a shudder. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, as he made chance change. "What brings you out this way?" "Just passing through," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Heading home after visiting family." He nodded slowly, a strange glint in his eye. "Long drive ahead of you. Still, you ought to be careful. Lots of bad folks out on these roads at night." I forced a smile. "Thanks for the advice. I'll be fine." I turned to leave, but his next word stopped me. "Old told you sure about that?" I looked back at him, my heart racing. He was smiling now, but there was nothing friendly about it. It was predatory, like a wolf eyeing its next meal. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He came out from behind the counter, moving with a deliberate slowness that was somehow more terrifying than if he rushed at me. "I mean, pretty young thing. Like you, all alone out here. Anything could happen. Maybe you should stick around for a bit. I could keep you company." I backed away, my hand fumbling for the door handle behind me. "No thanks. I really need to get going." His smile widened, showing yellow teeth. "Aw, come on. Now don't be like that. I'm just trying to be friendly." I yanked the door open and stumbled outside, my breath coming in short gasps. I half ran to my car, fumbling with my keys. I could hear his heavy footsteps behind me, getting closer. just as I reached my car, his hand clamped down on my arm, spinning me around. "Hey," he growled, all pretense of friendliness gone. "I'm talking to you." I tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Let go of me," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll scream." He laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Go ahead, ain't nobody around for miles to hear you." Panic surged through me. I looked around, desperately searching for anything or anyone that might help, but he was right. There was nothing but darkness and empty fields as far as the eye could see. That's when I saw it, headlights in the distance growing brighter. As they approached, someone was coming. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a new wave of fear. What if it was someone who knew this man? What if it was an accomplice? The man saw the headlights too. His grip on my arm loosened slightly. As he turned to look, I seized the opportunity with all the strength I could muster. I brought my knee up hard between his legs. He let out a strangled yelp and doubled over. I wrenched my arm free and scrambled into my car, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, but finally the engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, tires squealing as I backed away. The man was still on the ground, cursing and trying to get up. As I shifted into drive, I saw the other vehicle pull into the gas station, a semi-truck, its headlights illuminating the scene like a spotlight. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I floored it, speeding out of the gas station and back onto the highway. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind me, swallowed up by the darkness. I drove for hours, not daring to stop again until I was well into the next state. Even then, I chose a busy truck stop right off the interstate, brightly lit and full of people. As I sat in my car, hands still shaking on the steering wheel, I tried to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to call the police to report what had happened, but what could I tell them? That a creepy guy at a gas station had grabbed my arm and said some threatening things. I had no proof, no witnesses, and something told me that even if I did report it, nothing would come of it. How many other women had he done this to? How many had been less lucky than me in the days that followed? I couldn't shake the memory of that night, the way he looked at me, the feel of his hand on my arm, the certainty in his voice when he said no one would hear me scream. I had nightmares about what might have happened if that truck hadn't shown up when it did. I've taken that same drive many times since then to visit my sister, but I never stop at small isolated gas stations anymore. I plan my route carefully, making sure I only need to stop in busy areas with plenty of people around, and I always keep my doors locked and my phone close at hand. Sometimes when I'm driving at night and I see a lone gas station glowing in the distance, I think about that man. Is he still there waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to stop by? How many others have fallen into his trap? I'll never know for sure what his intentions were that night, but I do know one thing: I got lucky, and I'll never take that kind of risk again, because out there on those lonely stretches of highway where the darkness seems to go on forever and help is always just a little too far away, anything can happen, and not everyone gets a lucky break like I did. The flickering fluorescent light cast an eerie glow over the empty office, shadows dancing in the corners as if they had a life of their own. I should have known better than to stay so late, but I had no idea that my dedication to catching up on work would lead me into a nightmare as the maintenance man's footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing closer with each passing second. I realized with a sinking feeling that I was trapped in a game of cat and mouse, and I was the mouse. It had started as just another long night at the office as a junior analyst at a big financial firm. I was used to burning the midnight oil. The promise of a promotion dangled tantalizingly close, and I was determined to prove myself worthy. So when everyone else packed up and headed home at 6 o'clock p.m., I hunkered down at my desk armed with coffee and determination. The office always felt different. At night, the usual bustle of ringing phones and chattering coworkers gave way to an almost sepulchral silence broken only by the soft hum of computers and the occasional distant sound of the cleaning crew. I actually preferred it this way, no distractions. Just me and my spreadsheets. I lost track of time, immersed in a particularly tricky financial model. It wasn't until I looked up and saw the clock reading 11:30 p.m. that I realized how late it had gotten. The cleaning crew had long since finished their rounds, and as far as I knew, I was the only one left in the building. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside our office, slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to pause outside the door before moving on. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was probably just security doing their nightly rounds. I told myself nothing to worry about, but something about those footsteps set my nerves on edge. They didn't sound like the brisk, purposeful stride of our usual security guards. These were slower, almost hesitant, as if whoever it was trying not to be heard. I was debating whether to investigate when there was a knock at the door. I jumped, my heart suddenly racing. Hello, I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet office. The door opened slowly, revealing a man in a faded blue jumpsuit. He looked to be in his mid-50s, with graying hair and a face that seemed perpetually set in a frown. Oh, he said, sounding surprised. Didn't realize anyone was still here. I relaxed a little. Just the maintenance guy, probably here to fix something. Yeah, just catching up on some work, I said with a nervous laugh. Is everything okay? He nodded, stepping into the office. Just need to check the wiring in here, won't take long. Something about his demeanor felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted around the room, never quite meeting mine, or the way he kept his hand in his pocket, as if clutching something. I'm okay, I said, turning back to my computer. I'll just be here if you need anything. He grunted in acknowledgement and moved to the far corner of the office, kneeling down by an electrical outlet. I tried to focus on my work, but I found myself hyper-aware of his presence, on of every move he made. After a few minutes, I realized he wasn't actually doing anything. He was just kneeling there, occasionally making a show of fiddling with something, but mostly just waiting, watching. I cleared my throat. Everything all right over there? He stood up abruptly, and I caught a glimpse of something metallic in his hand before he shoved it back in his pocket. Fine, he said gruffly, just taking longer than I thought. My heart was pounding now. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I needed to get out of here. Well, I should probably be heading home, I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I started packing up my things. It's getting late. He moved faster than I expected, suddenly blocking the path to the door. Not yet, he said, his voice low and menacing. Are we not done here? I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He pulled his hand out of his pocket, revealing a wicked-looking knife. The fluorescent lights glinted off its blade, and I felt my blood turn to ice. I mean, he said, a cruel smile twisting his feeder, that you picked the wrong night to work late. My mind raced, searching for a way out. The office suddenly felt tiny, claustrophobic. I was acutely aware of how alone we were, how far away help was. Even if I screamed, would anyone hear me? Look, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I don't know what you want, but you don't have to do this. I won't tell anyone I saw you. Just let me go, and we can both forget this ever happened. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent chills down my spine. Oh, I'm afraid it's too late for that. You see, I've been watching this place for weeks, waiting for the right moment, and then you had to go, and messing up all my plans. He took a step closer, the knife gleaming in his hand. I backed away, feeling the edge of my desk press against my legs. Please, I begged. I have family, friends, people will look for me. They won't find you, he said, his voice eerily calm. No one ever does. In that moment, I realized with horrifying clarity that this wasn't his first time. How many others had he cornered like this? How many had begged for their lives in this very office? I glanced frantically around the room, looking for anything I could use. As a weapon, my eyes landed on the heavy desk lamp to my right. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. As he took another step forward, I made my move. I grabbed the lamp, yanking it free from its cord, and swung it with all my might. It connected with his arm, causing him to cry out in pain and surprise. The knife clattered to the floor. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear him cursing behind me, the sound of his footsteps giving chase. I ran down the hallway, making for the stairs. The elevator would be too slow, too easy for him to trap me. I burst through the stairwell door and started down, taking the steps two at a time. His footsteps echoed in the stairwell, getting closer. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning with the effort. 3 floors down, 2-1 finally. I reached the ground floor and ran for the lobby. The night security guard looked up in surprise as I burst out of the stairwell. Help, I gasped. Call the police. The maintenance man emerged from the stairwell a moment later, but stopped short when he saw the guard. For a second, we all stood frozen, a tableau of predator, prey, and unexpected witness. Then he turned and ran, disappearing back into the stairwell. The guard, finally grasping the situation, called for backup and the police, while keeping me safely behind the security desk. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and questions. They searched the building, but found no trace of the man. He had vanished into the night, leaving behind only the knife he dropped in our struggle. In the days that followed, I learned that there had been a string of disappearances in the area over the past few years. Young professionals working late, vanishing without a trace. The police suspected my attacker might be connected, but they had no solid leads. I quit my job soon after. No promotion was worth the nightmares that plagued me, the constant feeling of being watched. I moved to a new city, started over, but even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that night. The flickering lights, the glint of the knife, the look in his eyes that told me done this before and would do it again. Sometimes when I'm working late in my new office, I'll hear footsteps in the hallway and feel that same cold fear wash over me. I know now that the monsters aren't just in the shadows or under the bed. Sometimes they wear uniforms and carry toolboxes, hiding in plain sight until the moment they decide to strike. I was lucky I got away, but I often wonder about the others, the ones who weren't so fortunate. And I wonder if he's still out there waiting for the next person to stay just a little too late at the office. The moment I realized he wasn't just another hiker, my blood ran cold. His recurring presence on the trail, always just far enough away to seem coincidental, suddenly took on a sinister meaning as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I knew with chilling certainty that this remote hiking trail had become a predator's hunting ground, and I was the prey. I've always loved hiking alone. There's something about the solitude, the connection with nature, that I find deeply therapeutic. This particular trail was one I'd been wanting to tackle for months. A challenging 15 loop through some of the most beautiful and remote wilderness in the state. I'd prepared meticulously, packing all the essentials and letting a friend know my planned route and expected return time. The day started perfectly. The weather was ideal, cool and crisp, with a light breeze that carried the scent of pine and wild flowers. The trail was everything I'd hoped for: scenic vistas, challenging terrain, and blissful solitude. I encountered a few other hikers in the miles, exchanging friendly nods and brief greetings. But as I progressed deeper into the wilderness, the encounters became fewer and far between. It was around midday when I first noticed him. I'd stopped at a particularly breathtaking overlook to eat my lunch and take some photos. As I was packing up to continue, I spotted a figure on the trail below, just a glimpse, really a man in a dark jacket and Hat moving at a steady pace. I didn't think much of it at the time. Other people were bound to be enjoying the trail on such a beautiful day, but then I saw him. Again and again, always at a distance, always just for a moment before he disappeared around a bend or into a thicket. At first, I rationalized it, the trail looped back on itself in places. It was entirely possible for hikers to leapfrog each other throughout the day, but as the afternoon wore on, a nagging sense of unease began to grow in the pit of my stomach. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently, scanning the trail behind me each time I caught sight of him. He seemed a little closer, though still maintaining the calculated distance. I picked up my pace, my heart rate increasing from more than just the exertion. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend in the trail, I came face with an elderly couple resting on a fallen log. I nearly cried with relief at the sight of other people. Lovely day for a hike, isn't it? The woman said with a warm smile. I nodded, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. It is. Say, have you noticed a man on the trail wearing a dark jacket and hat? The couple exchanged glances. Can't say that we have. The man replied, we've only seen a handful of people all day, and no one fitting the description. My stomach dropped. How is that possible? I'd seen him so many times, unless he'd been deliberately staying out of sight of other hikers. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I thanked the couple and continued on, my mind racing. I was still several miles from the trailhead, and daylight was starting to fade. I knew I needed to get off this trail as quickly as possible. But I was deep in unfamiliar territory. Going off trail could be just as dangerous as staying on it. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the path behind me. Not bothering to look back, I broke into a run. The trail here was rough, roots and rocks threatening to trip me with every step, but fear propelled me forward. I could hear the footsteps behind me quicken. In response, I rounded a corner and found myself at a fork in the trail. Without hesitation, I took the path that seemed to head downhill, hoping it would lead me back to civilization faster. The footsteps behind me paused momentarily at the fork, then resumed, growing louder. My lungs were burning, my legs aching, but I didn't dare slow down. I chanced to glance over my shoulder, and my heart nearly stopped. He was there, much closer than before, moving with a speed and agility that seemed almost inhuman. In that brief look I caught a glimpse of his face twisted in a predatory grin that made my blood run cold. I turned back just in time to see the trail ahead of me disappear. I skid to a stop at the edge of a steep ravine, loose pebbles cascading down the slope. I was trapped, nowhere left to run. A voice said behind me, low and menacing. I turned slowly, my back to the precipice. He stood there, barely winded from the chase, that terrible grin still plastered on his face. Up close, I could see the coldness in his eyes, the complete lack of empathy or humanity. Please, I gasped, my voice horror from exertion and fear. Why are you doing this? He tilted his head, regarding me with a curiosity that was somehow more terrifying than outright aggression. Why does a wolf hunt a deer? He asked. Because it's in our nature. Some of us are predators, some are prey. You've given me quite the exciting chase, I'll give you. Then he took a step forward, and I edged back, feeling loose rocks shift under my feet. You don't have to do this, I pleaded. Just let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear. He laughed, a chilling sound devoid of any real mirth. Oh, I'm afraid that's not an option. You see, this isn't my first hunt, and it certainly won't be my last. I can't have you running off to the authorities now, can I? My mind raced, searching desperately for a way out. The ravine behind me was steep, but not a sheer drop. If I could somehow get past him, maybe I could scramble down, find a place to hide. He must have seen the calculation in my eyes, because his grin widened. Go ahead, he said, gesturing to the ravine. Try it. I do so enjoy a challenge. In that moment, I made a decision. I'd rather take my chances with the ravine than face whatever he had planned. I tend preparing to make a break for it, but before I could Move, a shout rang out from further up the trail. Hello, is someone there? The man's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing. I seized the opportunity with every ounce of strength I had left. I lunged forward, driving my shoulder into his midsection. He stumbled back, caught off guard, and I darted past him, back up the trail. Help, I screamed, my voice echoing through the trees. Please help me, I heard cursing behind me, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I nearly collided with a group of hikers, their faces etched with concern. Are you all right? One of them asked, steadying me. As I stumbled to a stop, I shook my head, gasping for breath. There's a man, he's been following me, tried to attack me. They looked alarmed, glancing down the trail behind me. We didn't see anyone, another hiker said, but let's get you out of here, just in case. Surrounded by the group, I made my way back to the trailhead. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, convinced he was still out there watching and waiting. But we made it back without incident. The police were called, a report was filed. They searched the area, but found no trace of the man I described. Part of me was relieved, but a larger part was terrified by the idea that he was still out there, perhaps already seeking his next victim. In the weeks that followed, I struggled with nightmares and anxiety. Every time I left my house, I found myself scanning faces in the crowd, half expecting to see him. I couldn't shake the memory of his cold eyes, that predatory grin. I haven't been hiking since that day. The thought of being alone in the wilderness now fills me with dread rather than peace. But sometimes, when I'm driving past a trailhead or see hikers setting out with their backpacks, I feel a pang of longing for the solitude and freedom I once found in those remote places. I know that one day I'll find the courage to hit the trails again, but next time, I won't be alone, and I'll never forget the lesson I learned on that beautiful, terrifying day, that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones that look just like us. The moment my daughter's imaginary friend moved her toy across the room without touching it, I knew we weren't dealing with a figment of her imagination anymore. As the doll's lifeless eyes seemed to follow me, a chill ran down my spine, and I realized that the innocent laughter of my child might be masking something far more sinister. We'd moved into the old Victorian house just 4 months ago. My wife Sarah and I had been thrilled to find such a spacious home within our budget. Sure, it needed some work, but we saw it as an opportunity to make it our own. Our daughter Lily, who had just turned 5, was excited about having a big room all to herself. The first few weeks were a flurry of unpacking, painting, and settling, and Lily seemed to adjust well, exploring every nook and cranny of the house with the unbridled curiosity of a child. It was about a month after we moved in that she first mentioned her new friend. Daddy, she said one evening as I was tucking her into bed, Emily says she likes our new house. I smiled, assuming this was just another imaginary friend. Lily had always had a vivid imagination. Oh, and who's Emily? Lily pointed to the empty corner of her room. She's right there, silly. She says she's lived here for a very long time. I played along, as parents do. Well, tell Emily we're glad she likes it. Good night, sweetheart. I kissed her forehead and turned out the light, thinking nothing more of it. But Emily kept coming up, and conversation. Lily would tell us about the games they played together, the secrets Emily shared with her. At first, Sarah and I found it cute. We even joked about how detailed Lily's imagination was creating this whole backstory for her invisible friend. Things started to change about 4 weeks after Emily first appeared. I was in the kitchen one morning making breakfast when I heard a crash from the living room. I rushed in to find a vase shattered on the floor, water and flowers strewn about. Lily was standing nearby, her eyes wide. Emily did it, she said, her voice trembling slightly. She was trying to smell the flowers, but she knocked it over. I sighed, reaching for the broom. Lily, honey, you know you shouldn't make up stories. If you accidentally knocked it over, just tell me. I won't be mad. But she was insistent. It wasn't me, Daddy. it was Emily. She feels really bad about it. I cleaned up the mess, making a mental note to talk to Sarah about Lily's increasing reliance on this imaginary friend as a scapegoat. But as I was sweeping up the last of the glass, I noticed something odd. The vase had been in the center of the coffee table, well out of Lily's reach. How had she managed to knock it over from where she was standing? I brushed it off, chalking it up to my own misremembering of where the vase had been. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, strange occurrences became more frequent. Objects would move when no one was near them. Doors would slam shut on perfectly still days. And always Lily would attribute it to Emily. Sarah and I began to worry. We talked about taking Lily to a child psychologist, concerned that this imaginary friend was becoming too real for her. But then something happened that made us question everything we thought we knew. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Lily was playing in her room while Sarah and I were downstairs watching TV. Suddenly, we heard Lily scream. We bolted upstairs, our hearts racing. When we burst into her room, Lily was huddled in the corner, pointing at her dollhouse. "Emily's mad," she whimpered. "She doesn't want me to play with her things." I was about to comfort her when I saw it. One of the dolls, a porcelain figure with blonde hair and a blue dress, was moving, not falling, not rolling, but moving, as if an invisible hand was dragging it across the floor of the dollhouse. Sarah gasped beside me, and the doll suddenly dropped lifeless. Once more we stood there frozen, trying to process what we just seen. "See," Lily said, her voice small, "but I told you Emily was not." After we'd finally gotten Lily to sleep, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table, both nursing cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. "What are we going to do?" Sarah whispered, her face pale in the dim light. I shook my head, still struggling to believe what I'd seen. "I don't know, maybe we're just tired, stressed from the move. We could be imagining things." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. We'd both seen that doll move, and deep down I knew it wasn't the first unexplainable thing I'd witnessed in this house. We decided to do some research on the house's history. It took some digging, but what we found chilled us to the bone. In 1925, a family had lived here. Parents and their young daughter, Emily. Emily had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. The official report said it was an accident, but there were whispers of foul play. Armed with, we tried to approach the situation rationally. We set up cameras in Lily's room and around the house, hoping to catch evidence of whatever was happening. For days, nothing unusual appeared on the footage. But then one night, we captured something that made my blood run cold. It was around 2 a.m. The camera in Lily's room showed her sleeping peacefully in her bed. Suddenly, the rocking chair in the corner began to move slowly at first, then picking up speed. It rocked back and forth for nearly a minute before abruptly stopping, and then faintly, we heard a child's giggle, not Lily's, but another girl's laugh echoing through the silent room. We were terrified, but we felt trapped. We couldn't afford to move again so soon. And who would buy a house we told them was haunted? So we tried to cope. We talked to Lily about Emily, asking her to tell us everything she knew about her spectral friend. Emily's lonely. Lily told us one day, she says her parents went away a long time ago and never came back. She just wants someone to play with. It was heartbreaking and terrifying in equal measure. We were dealing with the ghost of a child, one who had likely suffered a traumatic death. But how could we help her, and more importantly, how could we ensure Lily's safety? We tried everything we could think of. We had the house blessed by a priest. We consulted a medium who attempted to communicate with Emily. We even considered hiring paranormal investigators, but feared it might. Through it all, the activity continued. Objects would move, doors would open and close on their own. And sometimes late at night we'd hear the faint sound of a child singing an old lullaby. Lily, for her part, seemed unafraid. She talked about Emily as if she was just another friend, telling us about the games they played and the stories Emily told her about the old days. It was about 6 months after we'd moved in that things came to a head. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of Lily talking groggy and disoriented. I made my way to her room. The door was ajar, and I could hear her voice clearly. "But I don't want to go, Emily. This is my home." I froze my hand on the door knob. Another voice, faint but distinctly different from Lily's, responded, "But we could have so much fun together. Don't you want to be my friend forever?" I burst into the room, my heart pounding. Lily was sitting up in bed, looking at the foot of her bed, where for just a moment I saw the translucent figure of another little girl. She turned to look at me, her eyes sad and hollow before fading away. Lily looked up at me, tears in her eyes. "Daddy, Emily wants me to go away with her. She says we could play forever, but I don't want to leave you and Mommy." I gathered Lily in my arms, holding her tight. "It's okay, sweetheart, you're not going anywhere. Emily is. Emily needs to move on. This isn't her home anymore." That night was a turning point. Sarah and I realized we couldn't keep living like this, constantly fear for our daughter's safety. We reached out to a renowned paranormal expert who specialized in helping spirits move on. The process was intense. For 4 days, our house was filled with sage smoke and prayers. The expert communicated with Emily, learning her story and helping her understand that it was time to leave this plane. On the final night, we all gathered in Lily's room. The air felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. And then suddenly, we saw her, Emily, looking just as she had in the old photographs we'd found. She smiled, a peaceful expression on her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice echoing softly. "Thank you for being my friend, Lily." And then, in a flash of soft light, she was gone. The heaviness in the air lifted, and for the first time since we'd moved in, the house felt truly peaceful. In the months that followed, we had no more supernatural experiences. Lily occasionally talked about Emily, but more in the way one would reminisce about a friend who had moved away. We still live in that old Victorian house. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I think I hear the faint echo of a child's laughter, but it no longer fills me with dread. Instead, I smile, hoping that wherever Emily is now, she's at peace. Our experience changed me. I'm more open now to the idea that there are things in this world we can't explain, and I'm grateful in a way for the ghost of the little girl who taught us about friendship, compassion, and the enduring power of love, even from beyond the grave. The moment I saw him standing in my bedroom doorway, his silhouette etched against the hallway light, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The Airbnb host's smile, once welcoming, now seemed predatory in the midnight gloom. As he took a step forward, the floorboard creaking under his weight, I realized with horrifying clarity that this vacation rental had become my prison. It had all started innocently enough. I'd been planning this solo trip for months, a chance to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life and clear my head after a messy breakup. When I found the listing for a quaint cottage in a small coastal town, it seemed perfect. The photos showed a cozy interior, a beautiful garden, and a view of the ocean that took my breath away. The host, Mark, had excellent reviews praising his hospitality and local knowledge. I arrived on a sunny afternoon, the sea breeze carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers. Mark was there to greet me, all smiles and friendly chatter as he helped me with my bags. He was older than I expected, probably in his late 50s, with graying hair and laughed lines around his eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "Welcome to your home away from home," he said, opening the front door with a flourish. The cottage was even more charming in person, with whitewashed walls, a stone fireplace, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. Mark gave me a quick tour, pointing out the amenities and offering suggestions for local attractions. "If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask," he said, As he handed me the keys, I'm just a phone call away. The first couple of days were blissful. I spent my time exploring the town, walking along the beach, and curling up with a good book in the cottage's reading nook. It was exactly the peaceful getaway I had hoped for, but on the third day things started to change. I returned from a hike to find Mark in the cottage watering the plants. He seemed surprised to see me, though he quickly covered it with a smile. "Oh, hello there, hope you don't mind me popping and just wanted to make sure the plants were taken care of." I assured him it was fine, but something about the encounter left me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been looking through my things. The next day it happened again. This time he said he was checking the heating system. The day after that he was just in the neighborhood and wanted to make sure I had enough towels. Each time his visits seemed to last a little longer. He'd ask questions about my life, my job, my relationship status. At first, I wrote it off as friendliness, maybe loneliness. But as the week wore on, his attention began to feel suffocating. I started to notice little things out of place in the cottage. My clothes weren't folded quite the way I had left them. My laptop had been moved slightly on the desk once. I could have sworn I smelled his aftershave on my pillow. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. After all, Mark had dozens of positive reviews. Surely, if he was creepy or inappropriate, someone would have mentioned it. But the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach grew with each passing day. On the 6th night of my stay, I woke up around 2 a.m. thirsty and disoriented. As I stumbled to the kitchen for a glass of water, I froze there. Silhouetted in the moonlight streaming through the window was a figure standing in the garden staring at the cottage. Even in the darkness, I recognized Mark's stocky build and the outline of his baseball cap. My heart pounding, I ducked out of sight. What was he doing out there in the middle of the night? I waited, barely breathing, until I saw him turn and walk away. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. By morning, I had convinced myself that I must have been dreaming. Mark had been nothing but kind, if a bit overly attentive. Surely my imagination was running wild. But that afternoon when he showed up unannounced again, I couldn't shake my unease. This time he said he needed to check the smoke detectors. As he moved from room to room, I noticed how his eyes lingered on my personal belongings, how he seemed to be memorizing the layout of my suitcase. "You know," he said casually, as he finished up, "I've really enjoyed having you here. It's not often I get such charming company." The way he said it, coupled with the look in his eyes, made my skin crawl. I mumbled something non-committal and practically pushed him out the door. As soon as he was gone, I double-checked all the locks and wedged a chair under the doorknob for good measure. That night, I lay awake, every creak and groan of the old cottage setting my nerves on edge. I was starting to regret booking such an isolated place. The charm of being away from it all now felt dangerously lonely. Just as I was finally drifting off, a sound jolted me awake. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, were coming from the living room. I sat up, my heart in my throat, straining to listen. The steps moved slowly, deliberately, as if someone was taking great care not to make noise. I reached for my phone with trembling hands, ready to call for help, but as I unlocked the screen, I remembered with a sinking feeling that there was no cell service out here. Mark had mentioned it as a selling point, a chance to truly disconnect. Now, it felt like a death sentence. The footsteps grew closer, pausing outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, praying that whoever it was would go away. But then slowly the door handle began to turn. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I leapt out of bed, grabbing the heavy bedside lamp. As the door swung open, revealing Mark's hulking silhouette, I didn't hesitate. I swung the lamp with all my might, connecting with a sickening thud. Mark went down hard, crumpling to the floor with a groan. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I ran barefoot and in my pajamas out of the cottage and into the night. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. I had no idea which direction led to town, so I just ran my feet Pounding against the dirt road, every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every rustle in the bushes sent a fresh wave of terror through me after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I saw lights in the distance, a gas station still open despite the late hour. I burst through the door, startling the sleepy-looking clerk behind the counter. "Please," I gasped. "I need help. Someone broke into my rental cottage. I think he was going to—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of what might have happened finally hitting me. The clerk, to his credit, didn't hesitate. He locked the door and called the police. As we waited for them to arrive, he gave me a bottle of water and a shock blanket from the first aid kit. When the police finally got there, I told them everything about Mark's increasingly frequent visits, the feeling of being watched, and finally the break-in. They took my statement and sent officers to the cottage, but by the time they got there, Mark was gone. The investigation that followed revealed a horrifying truth: Mark wasn't the property owner at all. The real owner, an elderly woman who lived in another state, had no idea her property was being rented out. The man I knew as Mark had somehow gained access to the cottage and had been using it to lure in vulnerable travelers for months. They found hidden cameras throughout the cottage and evidence that other renters had stayed there unaware they were being watched. In Mark's nearby home, they discovered a trove of stolen and personal items, souvenirs from his months of therapy. Before I could sleep through the night again, I still have nightmares about that shadowy figure in my doorway, about what might have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did. The experience changed me. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the potential dangers lurking behind friendly smiles and 5-star reviews. But I refuse to let fear control my life. I still travel, still explore new places. I just do it with open eyes and a healthy dose of skepticism. As for Mary, he was eventually caught trying to set up a similar scheme in another town. He's serving time now, but sometimes I wonder about the other victims, the ones who might not have been as lucky as me. I hope they found peace, and I hope my story serves as a warning to others, because the truth is sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who seem the most harmless. They hide behind welcoming smiles and offers of hospitality, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But if we stay alert, if we trust our instincts, we can spot them before it's too late. And maybe, just maybe, we can turn the tables on them, transforming from potential victims into survivors who live to tell the tale. The sound of splintering wood jolted me awake, my heart leaping into my throat as I realized the cabin door was being forced open. In that moment, the quaint weekend getaway I'd envisioned transformed into a nightmare, and I knew with chilling certainty that I was trapped in the middle of nowhere with no one to hear me scream. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The stress of my job in the city had been slowly eating away at me, and when I stumbled across an ad for a secluded cabin rental, it seemed like the perfect escape. Unplug and unwind. The listing had promised just you and nature. Now, as I huddled in the darkness, those words took on a sinister new meaning. The drive out had been long but beautiful. I watched as towering skyscrapers gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. The cabin itself was about an hour's drive from the nearest town, tucked away at the end of a winding dirt road. As I pulled up, I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease. The cabin was everything I'd hoped for: rustic but charming, with a wide porch and windows that looked out over a stunning vista of trees and mountains. The owner, a gruff older man named Bill, met me there to hand over the keys and give me a quick tour. Cell service is spotty out here, he warned as he was leaving. Landline works if you need it, though. Enjoy your stay. With a wave, he was gone, leaving me alone with a whisper of wind through the trees and the promise of peace and quiet. The first day was blissful. I hiked, read books on the porch, and watched a stunning sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. As night fell, I built a fire in the old stone fireplace and settled in, with a glass of wine, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I was washing dishes after dinner when I caught a glimpse of movement outside the kitchen window. Just for a second, I could have sworn I saw a figure dart between the trees at the edge of the clearing. I peered out into the darkness. Why? But there was nothing there, just shadows and stillness. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just a deer or some other woodland creature, but I couldn't quite quell the unease that had taken root in the pit of my stomach. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before going to bed. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside had me on edge. I dozed fitfully, drifting in and out of uneasy dreams, and then, sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. My eyes flew open, heart pounding. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving from one end of the porch to the other, then silence. I held my breath, praying it was just my imagination running wild, but then I heard it again, the soft creak of a floorboard, this time right outside my bedroom door. Panic surged through me. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, only to remember, with a sinking feeling, that there was no service. The landline was in the living room. I'd have to get past whoever was out there to reach it. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, grabbing the heavy flashlight I'd brought for hiking. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. Heart thundering in my chest, I crept towards the bedroom door. Just as I reached for the handle, I heard a new sound, the scrape of metal against metal. Someone was trying to pick the lock. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The bedroom window, could have I squeezed through it? I rushed over, fumbling with the latch. It was stuck, probably from years of disuse. I pushed harder, feeling the old would start to give. And then I heard it, the splintering crack of the front door giving way. Heavy footsteps entered the cabin. I redoubled my efforts on the window, not caring now about the noise I was making. Finally, with a groan of protesting, would it slid open. I was halfway out when my bedroom door burst open. A figure loomed in the doorway, backlit by the dim glow of the living room lamp I'd left on in the split second before I tumbled out the window. I caught a glimpse of a mask, dark eyes glinting behind it. I hit the ground hard, though breath knocked out of me, but fear is a powerful motivator. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring about the direction, just needing to put distance between myself and the cabin. The forest was pitch black, the trees nothing more than looming shadows. Branches whipped at my face and arms. As I stumbled through the underbrush, I could hear pursuit behind me, crashing footsteps and ragged breathing. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they might give out at any moment, and still I pushed on, terror driving me forward. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond a way. Eventually, I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed behind a large tree, gasping for air. The woods had gone quiet. I couldn't hear my pursuer anymore, but that didn't mean they weren't out there searching. I huddled there for what felt like hours, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. As the adrenaline wore off, the cold started to seep in. I was barefoot, dressed only in a t-shirt and pajama shorts. If I didn't find help or shelter soon, hypothermia would become a real concern. As the faint hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. I had to move, had to try and find my way back to the road. Slowly, painfully, I got to my feet. I picked a direction that I hoped would lead me out of the woods and started walking. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. More than once I rose at what I thought was the sound of footsteps, only to realize it was just my own paranoia playing tricks on me. The sun was fully up by the time I finally stumbled onto a dirt road. I could have cried with relief. I started down it, praying it would lead to help. After about a mile, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. A car engine, an old pickup truck, came around the bend, driven by an elderly man. who looked startled to see me. He stopped rolling down his window. "You all right, miss?" I must have looked AF fright, dirty, scraped up, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. Through chattering teeth, I managed to explain what had happened. The man, bless him, didn't hesitate. He ushered me into his truck and drove straight to the local sheriff's office. What followed was a blur of police statements, cups of coffee, and shock blankets. They sent deputies out to the cabin, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of the intruder. The front door had been forced open, just as I described, and they found much footprints throughout the house, but whoever had been there was long gone. They never caught who it was. The prevailing theory was that it was someone local who knew the cabin was usually empty and used it as a base for wealth. I try not to think too hard about what they might have been playing. It took a long time before I felt safe again, before I could sleep through the night without jolting awake at every sound. I still love nature, still go hiking and camping, but I'm more cautious now. I always make sure someone knows where I am, and I never go anywhere truly isolated without a reliable way to call for help. Sometimes on dark nights, when the wind is whispering through the trees, I remember those terrifying hours in the woods. I remember the feeling of being hunted, of being utterly alone with no one to hear me if I screamed. And I'm grateful that I trusted my instincts, grateful that I found the strength to run, grateful that I survived too, because that's the thing about experiences like this. They change you, they show you what you're capable of when pushed to the brink. I'm not the same person I was before that night in the cabin. I'm stronger now, more aware, more alive. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: sometimes the most beautiful, peaceful places can hide the darkest dangers. But if we stay alert, if we trust our gut and fight with everything we have, we can overcome even the most terrifying ordeals. So I'll keep exploring, keep seeking out those quiet, secluded spots. But now I do it with open eyes and a readiness to fight if I need to, because the world is full of beauty and wonder, but it's also full of shadows. And sometimes the only thing standing between us and those shadows is our own will to survive. The first time I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror, I thought nothing of it. By the third time, I changed direction, and they were still there. A chill ran down my spine as the empty highway stretched before me. A terrifying realization set in. This was no ordinary tailgater. Someone was hunting me, and I was running out of road. It had been a long day. I'd driven nearly 8 hours to attend my cousin's wedding in a small town I'd never heard of before. The invitation arrived. The ceremony was beautiful, the reception lively. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to get back home. Maybe it was the way my ex kept trying to corner me for just a quick chatting yell, or maybe it was the looming deadline for a project at work. Whatever the reason, I decided to make the drive back that night instead of staying over as I'd originally planned. I said my goodbyes around 11 p.m., hugging the happy couple and promising to visit again soon. The night air was crisp as I walked to my car, the stars brighter than I was used to seeing in the city. For a moment, I second-guessed my decision to leave, but then I remembered the mountain of work waiting for me, and I slid behind the wheel with a sigh. The first hour of the drive was uneventful. The roads were empty, which wasn't surprising given the late hour and rural location. I had my music playing softly, my mind wandering between thoughts of the wedding and the week ahead. It was around 12:30 a.m. when I first noticed the car behind me, just a pair of headlights in the distance, gradually getting closer. I didn't think much of it at first. This was the main highway. It made sense that there'd be other drivers even at this hour. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized the car wasn't passing me. It maintained a steady distance, always there in my rearview mirror, close enough that I could make out the shape of the vehicle, a dark sedan of some kind. but not close enough to read the license plate. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just another driver heading in the same direction. Still, a nagging feeling of unease started to grow in the pit of my stomach. I decided to test my theory out. The next exit, I took a right turn heading off the highway onto a smaller road. The car followed. My heart rate picked up a bit, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe they needed to exit here too. It didn't necessarily mean anything. I drove for a few miles on this new road before turning back towards the highway. The car was still behind me now. My palms were starting to sweat. This couldn't be a coincidence. I increased my speed a little, hoping to put some distance between us. The other car sped up too, matching my pace perfectly. I reached for my phone thinking to call for help, but my blood ran cold when I saw there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by hills that were probably blocking the cell towers. Panic started to set in. Who was following me? What did they want? My mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. An angry ex, a serial killer, someone who'd seen me leave the wedding and thought I'd make an easy target. I tried to focus on my breathing, to think logically. I needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere with people. But at 1 a.m. in rural America, my options were limited. I vaguely remembered passing a 23-hour truck stop about 40 miles back. If I could make it there, I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my car faster. The speedometer crept up 70, 80, 90 miles per hour. The headlights behind me grew smaller, and for a moment, I felt a surge of hope. But then, the other car sped up too. No matter how fast I went, it matched my speed, always staying the same distance behind me. It was like a nightmare where you're running but can't escape. I was driving recklessly now, taking curves too fast, constantly checking my rearview mirror. The road ahead was a blur, the yellow lines merging into a continuous streak. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I could hear my own ragged breathing over the roar of the engine. Suddenly, the headlights behind me flashed once, twice, 3 times, a clear signal. Whoever was driving wanted me to know that this was intentional. They were playing with me. Terror gripped me. This wasn't just someone happening to drive the same way. This was a pursuit, a hunt, and I was the prey. I tried to remember everything I'd ever heard about what to do in a situation like this. Keep driving, don't stop, find a populated area out here in the dead of night. Those rules seemed impossible to follow. The next time I checked my mirror, the car was closer, much closer. I could almost make out the outline of now a dark silhouette behind the wheel. As I watched, horrified, they flashed their lights again, and then, to my utter disbelief, started to ram my bumper. The first hit jolted me forward, my seatbelt cutting into my chest. The second nearly sent me off the road. I struggled to keep control of the car, my tires screeching as I swerved. In that moment of chaos, a memory surfaced, an old story my dad used to tell about a friend of his who'd been in a similar situation. The friend had managed to escape by, without letting myself think too hard about it, I slammed on my brakes. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The car behind me, clearly not expecting this move, swerved violently to avoid hitting me. It fishtailed, tires squealing before spinning off the road entirely. I didn't stop to see what happened next. I thwarted my engine, protesting as I pushed it to its limits. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. For several agonizing minutes, I drove like this, constantly checking my mirror for any sign of pursuit. But the road behind me remained dark and empty. Finally, blessedly, I saw lights ahead. The truck stopped. I pulled, and tires screeching, and practically fell out of my car. The few truckers milling about looked at me in alarm as I stumbled towards the store, babbling about being chased. The cashier, a kind-faced older woman, took one look at me and called the police. As we waited for them to arrive, she sat me down, gave me a cup of coffee, and listened as I poured out my story. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They took my statement and then went to check out the stretch of road where I'd last seen the car. They found skid marks and signs that a vehicle had gone off the road, but no car and no driver. In the days that followed, as I gave more statements and talked to more officers, a theory emerged. They believed I had been targeted by a method known as the highway game, a twisted form of entertainment for some bored and dangerous individuals. The goal was to terrify random drivers on empty roads, sometimes with deadly consequences. I was lucky. They told me my quick thinking and braking suddenly had likely saved my life, but the knowledge that my pursuers were never caught, that they might still be out there playing their sick game with other unsuspecting drivers, haunts me to this day. It's been years since that night, but I still can't drive on dark, empty roads without breaking into a cold sweat. Every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror sends a jolt of fear through me. I've become hypervigilant, always aware of my surroundings, always planning escape routes. Sometimes I wonder about the person who chased me. Who were they? What drove them to do something so terrifying and dangerous? Did they ever face consequences for their actions? Or are they still out there waiting for their next victim? I'll probably never know the answers to these questions, but I do know this: that night changed me forever. It showed me how quickly an ordinary situation can turn into a nightmare, how vulnerable we all are when we least expect it. Now, when I drive at night, I always make sure my phone is charged. I let someone know my route and expected route time, and I never ever assume that a car following me is just going the same way, because sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under the bed or in dark alleys. Sometimes they're right behind you on an empty highway, their headlights burning in your rear view mirror, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The moment I locked eyes with the figure in my back seat, I knew my life would never be the same. 1 second, I was driving home after another monotonous night shift, and the next, I was trapped in a moving vehicle with a stranger who had materialized out of thin air as the streetlights flickered by casting eerie shadows across their face. I realized that the real nightmare wasn't the long hours at work. It was what awaited me on the drive home. I've been working the night shift at the local factory for almost 3 years now. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and allows me to avoid the 9 to 5 rat race. Most nights I don't mind it. There's a certain peace to the quiet hours when the rest of the world is asleep. But lately things had started to feel off. It started about a month ago. I was leaving work, trudging across the nearly empty parking lot to my car. The factory is on the outskirts of town, surrounded by empty fields and patches of scraggly woods. As I fumbled for my keys, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You know that feeling when you're sure someone's watching you? It was like that, but amplified. I spun around, half expecting to see one of my coworkers trying to spook me, but there was no one there, just the distant glow of the factory lights and the vast empty darkness beyond. I shook it off, chalking it up to too much caffeine and too little sleep, but the feeling persisted night after night. As I left work, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. I started scanning the parking lot more carefully, my eyes straining to pierce the shadows. Sometimes I thought I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of something darting between cars or disappearing into the tree line. But whenever I looked directly, there was nothing. I mentioned it to a few coworkers on, but they just laughed it off. You're letting the graveyard shift get to you, man. They'd say, start getting some sun, you're turning into a vampire. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just sleep deprived and paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there waiting. About 3 weeks into this, I started noticing things in my car. Nothing major at first, just little things out of place. The rearview mirror adjusted slightly, the radio tuned to a station I never listened to once. I could have sworn I smelled cigarette smoke, even though I don't smoke, and neither does anyone who rides in my car. I started double-checking my locks, even going so far as to change them. But it didn't help. The subtle signs of intrusion continued becoming more bold. One night, I found muddy footprints on the floor mat of the passenger side. Another time, There was a half-eaten candy bar in the cup holder, a brand I never buy. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. I considered quitting my job, but in this economy with my bills it wasn't an option. So I endured, growing more anxious with each passing night. Then came the night that changed everything. It had been a particularly grueling shift. Equipment malfunctions had kept us working overtime, and by the time I clocked out, the sky was already lightening with the first hints of dawn. I was exhausted, my eyes gritty from lack of sleep. As I walked to my car, the familiar sensation of being watched washed over me. But this time, it was stronger than ever. I fumbled with my keys, my hand shaking slightly. As I unlocked the eyes slid into the driver's seat. I couldn't resist one last glance around the parking lot, empty. As always, I started the car and began the drive home, my mind already on the shower and bed that awaited me. The roads were empty at this hour, the world still and quiet. I drove on autopilot, the familiar route requiring little thought. About halfway home, I stopped at a red light, one of those interminably long ones that seem to last forever when you're the only car around. As I waited, I absently glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it, or rather saw him. There was a man in my back seat. For a moment, I thought I must be hallucinating from exhaustion. I blinked hard, certain that when I opened my eyes the back seat would be empty. But he was still there, a man I had never seen before, sitting calmly behind me, as if he had every right to be there. He was ordinary looking in a way that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been obviously menacing, middle-aged with thinning hair and a gettable face. He was dressed in nondescript clothing, a gray sweater, dark pants. He could have been anyone's neighbor or co-worker, except he was in my car, a car that had been empty when I got in, a car that I hadn't stopped driving. Our eyes met in the mirror, and he smiled, not a threatening smile, but a pleasant one, as if we were old friends encountering each other unexpectedly. "Hello," he said, his voice surprisingly warm and normal. "I've been waiting a long time to meet you." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My hands were frozen on the steering wheel, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. A distant part of my mind registered that the light had turned green, but I couldn't bring myself to care. "You're wondering how I got here?" he continued, still smiling. "It's quite simple, really. I've always been here. Why, watching, waiting. You just weren't ready to see me until now." A car horn blared behind me, shocking me out of my paralysis. Without thinking, I hit the gas, my car lurching forward. My mind was racing. What did he mean? He'd always been there. Was this the presence I'd been feeling all these weeks? "What do you want?" I managed to croak out, my eyes darting between the road and the rear view mirror. He chuckled, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "What? Oh, I don't want anything. I'm just here to observe, to experience. You humans are so fascinating. You know, the way you live your lives day in and day out, never realizing what's really out there." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What are you?" His smile widened, and for a moment I could have sworn his eyes glowed in the dim light of the car. "I'm many things, a traveler, an observer. Some might call me a ghost, or a demon, or an alien. But labels are so limiting, don't you think?" My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I was driving aimlessly now, having long since passed my turn for home. Part of me wanted to stop the car, to run, but another part, a deeper, more primal part, knew that running wouldn't help. Whatever this being was, it could find me anywhere. "Why me?" I asked, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. He leaned forward, and I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. It was cold, far colder than it should have been. "Why not you? You were open to it all those nights, feeling watched, knowing something was there. You were reaching out, whether you realized it or not." And I answered. I shuddered, fighting the urge to close my eyes. I had to keep driving, had to stay in control of something, even if it was just the car. "What happens now?" I whispered. He sat back, and I felt like I could breathe again. Now we talk. Now you learn there's so much more to this world than you know, my friend. So many layers of reality that you humans never see, but you will. Oh, you will. And so began the strangest and most terrifying night of my life. As I drove aimlessly through the pre-dawn hours, the being in my back seat talked he spoke of dimensions beyond our own, of creatures that exist in the spaces between seconds. He told me of ancient pacts and cosmic jokes, of worlds dying and being born in the blink of an eye. Some of it I understood, most of it was beyond my comprehension. But with each word, I felt my perception of reality shifting, crumbling at the edges. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, he fell silent. I realized we were back in the parking lot of the factory, though I had no memory of driving there. It's time for me to go, he said softly. But don't worry, I'll be back. We've only just begun. You and I blinked, and he was gone. The back seat was empty, as if he'd never been there at all, but the chill in the air remained, as did the lingering scent of ozone and something alien. I sat there for a long time, watching the sun rise, trying to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But I knew better. The world had changed, or perhaps I had nothing would ever be the same again. As I finally started my car to drive home, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time. For just a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. I don't know what tonight will bring. I don't know if he'll be back, or what other horrors might be waiting in the dark corners of the world. But I do know this: the night shift isn't just a job anymore. It's a gateway to something far more terrifying and wondrous than I ever could have imagined. And as I park my car and head into work, I can't help but wonder who else out there might look in their rearview mirror one night and find their entire world turned upside down. Be careful on those late night drives, my friends. You never know who or what might be hitching a ride. The moment I saw those desperate eyes peering out from the van window, I knew my quick pit stop was about to turn into the longest night of my life. What I didn't realize was that it would also be the most dangerous, as I found myself caught between a victim crying for help and the sinister figures determined to keep their secret hidden. It had been a long day on the road. I'm a long-haul trucker, and I'd been driving for nearly 11 hours straight, pushing to make a deadline. The sun had set hours ago, and the highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of black punctuated by the occasional flicker of headlights from oncoming traffic. I was tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that makes your eyes burn and your thoughts fuzzy. I knew I needed to stop soon, both to comply with regulations and to avoid becoming a danger to myself and others on the road. When I saw the sign for a rest area coming up, I decided to pull in for a quick break. The rest stop was like 100 others I'd seen AC across the country, a small parking lot, a couple of vending machines, and bathrooms that were probably best avoided if you had any other options at this hour. It was nearly deserted. There were a couple of other trucks parked in the far corner, their drivers likely catching some sleep, and a single van parked closer to the main building. I pulled my rig into one of the oversized spots and cut the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening after hours of road noise. I sat there for a moment, enjoying the stillness and stretching out the kinks in my back. As I was about to climb down from the cab, movement caught my eye that I'd noticed earlier. An older model, dark in color, seemed to rock slightly. At first, I thought maybe someone inside was just shifting around trying to get comfortable. But then I saw a hand press against the back window. Something about that hand made me pause. It wasn't the casual movement of someone adjusting their position. This was deliberate, almost frantic. And then I saw the face. It was just for a second, but in that moment our eyes met. A woman, probably in her late 20s or early 30s, her face pale and drawn with fear. She mouthed something. I couldn't make out the words, but the desperation in her eyes was clear. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was yanked back from the window. My Heart started racing. What had I just this woman in danger? Should I call the police? But even as these thoughts raced through my mind, I saw two men emerge from the front of the van. They looked ordinary, glance one tall and lean, the other shorter and stockier, but there was something in their body language, a kind of coiled tension that set off alarm bells in my head. They were scanning the parking lot, their movements casual, but their eyes alert. I ducked down in my seat, not wanting them to realize I had seen anything through the side mirror. I watched as they walked around the van, checking the doors. They spoke to each other in low voices, too quiet for me to hear. I was faced with a decision. I could pretend I hadn't seen anything, start up my truck and drive away. It would be the safe thing to do, the smart thing. But that woman's eyes haunted me. If she was in trouble and I did nothing, could I live with myself? With shaking hands, I reached for my phone. I called 911, report what I'd seen, and let the professionals handle it. But as I went to dial, my heart sank. No signal, of course. We were in the middle of nowhere, and cell coverage out here was spotty at best. I glanced back at the van. The two men were still outside, one of them smoking a cigarette, while the other paced back and forth. They seemed to be waiting for something or someone. I knew I had to do something, but what? I was just one person, unarmed and unprepared for any kind of. The thought of driving away and abandoning that woman to whatever fate awaited her was unbearable. Taking a deep breath, I made a decision. I'd try to get closer, maybe find a way to communicate with the woman in the van. If I could just let her know that help was coming, maybe that would be enough. I climbed out of my truck as quietly as I could, trying to look casual. I stretched like I was just taking a break from driving and started walking towards the vending machines. My path took me closer to the van, and I strained my ears to hear any sound from inside. As I got nearer, I could hear muffled voices, a man speaking, his tone harsh and threatening, followed by a softer voice, a woman's, pleading. My suspicions were confirmed. Something very wrong was happening in that van. I was so focused on trying to hear what was being said that I almost didn't notice one of the men approaching me. Help you with something, buddy? His voice was friendly enough, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady, just stretching my legs, grabbing a soda. Long night on the road, you know how it is. He nodded, but his eyes were cold, assessing. Yeah, I know how it is, but this ain't really a place to linger, if you know what I mean. Best get your drink and move on. The threat was clear, even if his words were polite. I mumbled in agreement and hurried to the vending machine, my mind racing. What could I do? I couldn't just leave, not now that I was certain something sinister was happening. As I pretended to deliberate over my drink choice, I saw the other man walk around to the back of the van. He opened the doors just a crack, said something I couldn't hear, then slammed them shut again. The whole van rocked with the force of it. That's when I heard it, a muffled scream, quickly cut off. It was faint but unmistakable, and it galvanized me into action without really thinking it through. I turned and sprinted back to my truck. I could hear shouts behind me, footsteps pounding on the pavement. I reached the cab, hauled myself up in, slammed the door. Just as one of the men reached me, he pounded on the door, yelling for me to open up. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. The engine roared to life. Just as the man started trying to force the door open, I threw the truck into gear and stomped on the gas. The big rig lurched forward, nearly running over the man's foot as he leaped back. In my side mirror, I could see both of them running back to their van. My mind was whirling. I couldn't outrun them in a big rig, not on these winding back roads. But I couldn't just drive away either. That woman needed help. Then I remembered there was a state trooper station about 20 miles up the road. If I could make it there, I pushed the truck as fast as it would go, taking turns faster than was safe. In my mirrors, I could see headlights gaining on me. The van was faster, more maneuverable. They were catching up. The next few minutes were a blur of fear and adrenaline. The van tried to pull alongside me several times, but I swerved using the size of my rig to force them back. At one point, I heard a loud bang. Were they shooting at me? Just when I thought I couldn't keep them off any longer, I saw at the lights of the trooper station. I laid on my horn, flashing my lights. As I pulled into the parking lot, the van screeched to a halt at the entrance, then peeled away, disappearing into the night. What followed was a whirlwind of questions, statements, and action. The troopers took my story seriously, immediately putting out an APB on the van. Within an hour, they'd found it abandoned on a side road about 10 miles away, and the woman, they found her bound and gagged in the back. She'd been kidnapped 3 days earlier, snatched off the street in broad daylight. If I hadn't stopped at that rest area, if I hadn't noticed, I don't like to think about what might have happened in the days and weeks that followed. As the case unfolded in the media, I struggled with what I'd experienced, the fear, the doubt, the what-ifs. But mostly I thought about how close I'd come to driving away, to minding my own business. It would have been easier, safer, but it wouldn't have been right. I still drive the long hauls, still stop at rest areas in the middle of the night, but now I pay more attention. I look a little closer, listen a little harder, because you never know when you might be someone's only chance at salvation. And sometimes the difference between being a bystander and a hero is just the courage to act. The moment I saw the shadowy figure in the photograph, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't there when I took the picture, I was sure of it, but as I stared at the Polaroid in my trembling hands, I couldn't deny the truth. Something impossible had found its way into my camera, and with each new photo, it was getting closer. I've always been a bit of a photography enthusiast, nothing serious, just a hobby to pass the time. I love the immediacy of Polaroid cameras, the way you could watch the image slowly develop before your eyes. So when I stumbled across an old Polaroid camera at a yard sale last weekend, I couldn't resist. The woman selling it was eager to get rid of it. It was my late husband, she explained, a hint of sadness in her eyes. I can't bear to look at it anymore, just take it, no charge. I tried to insist on paying, but she was adamant. As I turned to leave, she called out, "Just be careful what you capture with it." I laughed it off at the time, assuming she was just being superstitious. Only I had taken her warning seriously. The camera sat on my desk for a few days before I decided to test it out. It was a sunny afternoon, and I thought the bright light would be perfect for some test shots. I headed to the park near my apartment, the camera hanging around my neck. My first subject was an old oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching towards the sky. I framed the shot carefully, making sure to capture the play of sunlight through the leaves. The familiar whir of the camera was satisfying as it spit out the photo. I waved the Polaroid back and forth, watching as the image slowly appeared. The tree came into focus, looking exactly as I remembered it. But then, as the picture fully developed, I noticed something odd there. Just at the edge of the frame was a dark shape. It was blurry and indistinct, but it looked almost like a person standing behind the tree. I frowned, looking up at the tree in front of me. There was no one there. I scanned the area around me, but the park was nearly empty, just a couple joggers in the distance, and a woman walking her dog. Must be a smudge on the lens, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. I decided to take another picture, this time of a nearby flower bed. As I waited for the image to develop, I found myself holding my breath. The flowers came into view, vibrant and colorful, and there, in the background, was the same dark figure, only this time it was closer, more defined. I could make out the vague shape of a head and shoulders. My heart started to race. This couldn't be a coincidence. I looked around wildly, half expecting to see someone standing nearby, but there was no one. With shaking hands, I raised the camera one more time, or I pointed it at a park bench, my finger hesitating over the shutter button. Did I really want to see what would appear in this photo? but curiosity won out over fear, and I took the picture. As the image slowly appeared, I felt my blood run cold. The figure was there again, and this time it was unmistakable, a person standing directly behind the bench. Their features were blurred, but I could make out dark, hollow eyes staring directly at the camera, directly at me. I dropped the camera, the Polaroid fluttering to the ground. This was impossible. I was alone in the park. There was no one behind that bench, and yet the evidence was right there in front of me. I gathered up the photos and the camera, shoving them into my bag. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip it closed. I practically ran home, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from the photos following me once safely in my apartment. I spread the photos out on my kitchen table. The progression was clear and terrifying. In each photo, the figure was closer, more defined. What would happen if I took another picture? Would it be right there in the foreground? I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark, hollow eyes staring back at me. The next morning, blur-eyed and exhausted, I decided I needed answers. I packed up the camera and the photos and headed to the local university. There was a professor there known for his interest in paranormal phenomena. Maybe he could shed some light on what was happening. Professor Harris listened patiently as I recounted my story, his eyes widening as he examined the photos. Fascinating, he murmured, peering at the images through a magnifying glass. I've heard of similar occurrences, but I've never seen such clear evidence. What is it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What's happening? He leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. There are theories about certain objects, cameras included, that can capture things beyond our normal perception. Spirits, interdimensional beings, echoes of past events. This camera of yours, it seems to be photographing something that exists outside our reality. And whatever it is, it's aware of you. A chill ran down my spine at his words. Aware of me? What does that mean? It's approaching you in each photo, he explained, pointing to the progression. It's reacting to being photographed. I'd be very careful about using this camera again. I left his office with more questions than answers, the camera feeling like a lead weight in my bag. Part of me wanted to destroy it, to smash it to pieces and never think about it again. But another part, a part one wasn't proud of, was intensely curious what would happen if I took just one more photo. That night, alone in my apartment, I found myself taking out the camera. Again, my hands were shaking as I raised it to my eye. Just one more, I told myself, one more photo, and then I'll get rid of it. I pointed the camera at my living room, my finger hovering over the shutter button for a long moment. I hesitated. Did I really want to see what would appear before I could change my mind? I pressed the button. The flash lit up the room, momentarily blinding me. As the Polaroid slid out, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. With trembling hands, I held the photo, watching as the image slowly appeared. At first, all I could see was my living room, exactly as it had been when I took the picture. But then, as the image fully developed, I saw it. The figure was there, standing in the center of my living room. It was no longer a vague, shadowy shape. I could see every detail with terrifying clarity. It was tall and human, so with limbs that were too long and bent at odd angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a gaunt frame. But it was the face that made my blood run cold, where there should have been eyes. There were only dark, empty sockets. Its mouth was a gash across its face, filled with pointed teeth, and it was smiling a terrible, knowing smile that seemed to say, "I've found you." I dropped the photo, stumbling backward until I hit the wall. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the image on the floor. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement, slowly, hardly daring to breathe. I turned my head. There, standing in my living room, exactly where it had appeared in the photo, was the figure. It was motion, those empty eye sockets fixed on me. As I watched, paralyzed with terror, its mouth began to open wider. and wider until it seemed to split its head in half. I ran. I didn't stop to grab anything, didn't pause to put on shoes. I just ran out of my apartment, down the stairs, and into the street. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they might give out. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, in a well-lit convenience store parking lot, I realized the truth of my situation. I couldn't go back. Whatever that thing was, it had found a way into our world through the camera, and now it had found me. I've been on the move ever since that night. I stay in cheap motels, never in one place for too long. I've thrown away my phone, cut up my credit cards, anything that might allow that thing to track me. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I swear I can hear the roar of a camera, and in the shadows just at the edge of my vision, I catch glimpses of something tall and pale with empty eyes and a mouth full of pointed teeth. I don't know how long I can keep running. I don't know if there's anywhere I can hide. All I know is that I should have listened to that old woman at the yard sale. I should have been careful about what I captured, because sometimes when you take a picture, the picture takes you back the moment. I realized the footsteps weren't just an echo of my own. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the trail, I knew with terrifying certainty that I wasn't alone on this hike. Someone or some was following me, and as I quickened my pace, so did they. I've always been an avid hiker. There's something about the solitude of nature, the challenge of conquering a difficult trail, that's always called to me. I'd hiked this particular trail dozens of times before. It was my go-to when I needed to clear my head or escape the pressures of daily life. A 10-mile loop through dense forest culminating in a breathtaking view of the valley below. It was my idea of perfect. That day had started like any other. I'd arrived at the trailhead early, just as the morning mist was lifting from the trees. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I shouldered my backpack, double-checked my water supply, and set off with a spring in my step. The first few miles were uneventful. I fell into a comfortable rhythm, my boots crunching on the gravel path, my breathing steady, and even I passed a few other hikers early on, a couple taking photos of wildflowers, and older men with trekking poles who nodded a greeting as I passed. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, the trail grew quieter, more isolated. It was around the halfway point that I first noticed something off. I'd stopped to take a drink and admire a particularly stunning view when I heard it, the distinct sound of footsteps on the trail behind me. I turned, expecting to see another hiker, but the path was empty. The footsteps had stopped the moment I moved. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just an echo or my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I continued on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every time I rounded a bend or crested a hill, I could have sworn I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. The footsteps continued, always just far enough behind that I couldn't quite see their source. Sometimes they'd fade away entirely, only to start up again when I least expected it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal following at a distance, or perhaps the sound was carrying strangely in the dense forest. But deep down I knew better. As the afternoon wore on, my unease grew. The friendly forest that I knew so well suddenly seemed menacing. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I picked up my pace, eager to complete the loop and get back to my car, but the faster I went, the closer the footsteps seemed to get. They were no longer trying to be stealthy. Whoever or whatever was behind me was gaining ground, and they wanted me to know it. By the time the sun began to set, I was nearly running. The trail had never seemed so long, so winding. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but fear drove me onward. The footsteps behind me had broken into a run as well, matching my pace step for step. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw it, the final bend in the trail that I knew led to the parking lot. Relief flooded through me. I was almost there, almost safe. I burst out of the tree line, my eyes frantically searching for my car. And there it was, right where I'd left it that morning. But something was wrong. Even from a distance, I could see that all 4 tires were flat, the rubber shredded, as if by a knife or claws. I skid to a halt, my mind reeling. This couldn't be. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe I'd run over something on the drive up in. All 4 tires had slowly leaked air throughout the day, but even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew the truth. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had wanted to make sure I couldn't leave. The sound of footsteps behind me had stopped. Slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. I turned around. The trail was empty, no sign of my pursuer, but their car. Into the trunk of a tree at the edge of the clearing was a crude symbol, a circle with an X through it. It looked fresh, the pale wood exposed beneath the bark, still oozing sap. My hand shaking, I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I was miles from the nearest town, with no way to call for help. Night was falling fast, the forest around me growing darker by the second. I knew I couldn't stay here out in the open, but the thought of going back into those woods with whatever had been following me still out there was terrifying. In the end, survival instinct won out. I couldn't stay by my disabled car, exposed and vulnerable. I needed to find help, or at least a safe place to hold up until morning. Taking a deep breath, I turned on my phone's flashlight and plunged back into the forest. I didn't take the main trail this time. Instead, I bushwhacked through the underbrush, trying to move as quietly as possible, while still maintaining a quick pace. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set my heart racing. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps again, to feel hot breath on the back of my neck. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the dark, I saw a glimmer of light through the trees. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was a ranger station or a campsite with people who could help. As I drew closer, I saw it was a small cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney and warm light spilled from the windows. I nearly cried with relief. Surely whoever was inside would let me use their phone, or at least give me shelter for the night. I burst out of the tree line, ready to run to the cabin's door, but something made me hesitate. The cabin looked wrong somehow. It was old, far older than it should have been, given its location in a state park now. Wood was weathered and gray, the windows cloudy with age, and there, carved into the door, was that same symbol I'd seen on the tree, a circle with an X through it. As I stood there frozen with indecision, the cabin door began to open. A figure appeared in the doorway, backlit by the fire inside. I couldn't make out any features, but somehow I knew this was what had been following me. This was what had slashed my tires and herded me through the forest. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, no longer caring about stealth or direction. I just ran, crashing through bushes and leaping over fallen logs behind me. I could hear pursuit, no longer just footsteps, but a cacophony of snapping branches and inhuman growls. I ran until gave out, until I couldn't draw enough breath to keep going. I collapsed at the base of a massive old tree, certain that this was the end. I could hear my pursuer getting closer, could almost feel its presence bearing down on me. But then, just as I was about to give up hope, I heard something else, the distant rumble of a car. Engine summoning the last of my strength, I staggered to my feet and moved toward the sound. I broke through the tree line once more, this time emerging onto a road I didn't recognize. A car was approaching, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I waved my arms frantically, praying they would stop. The car slowed, then pulled over. An older couple peered out at me, concern turned etched on their faces. "Are you all right?" the woman asked, taking in my disheveled appearance and wild eyes. I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see my pursuer emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing there, just trees and darkness. I got lost, I stammered, the adrenaline starting to wear off. "Can you Please give me a ride to the nearest town, they agreed. And as we drove away, I watched the forest recede in the rear view mirror. I knew I should feel relief, but all I felt was a deep, unsettling certainty that this wasn't over. Whatever had been out there, whatever had lured me to that cabin, it wasn't done with me. I never went back to retrieve my car. I never hiked that trail again, but sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can hear footsteps. And I know deep in my bones that somewhere out there in the darkness something is still waiting for me to return. The moment I found him standing in my bedroom, his silhouette etched against the faint glow of streetlights filtering through my curtains, I knew I'd mistake my new neighbor, once charming and friendly, now loomed over me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. As he took a step forward, his voice a low whisper, "I just wanted to check on you." I realized with horrifying clarity that the locks on my doors meant nothing to someone who had wormed their way into my life so completely. It all started innocently enough. I just moved into my first apartment after graduating college, eager to start my new job and embrace the independence of adulthood. The building was nothing fancy, a modest complex on the outskirts of the city, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. I met Jake on my second day there. I was struggling with a box of books, trying to maneuver it up the stairs to my third-floor apartment. When he appeared beside me, "Need a hand with that?" he asked, flashing a warm smile. I gratefully accepted his help, and we chatted as we made our way up. Jake lived in the apartment next to mine. He told me he'd been there for about a year and loved the place. As we reached my door, he offered to show me around the neighborhood sometime, pointing out the best local spots. "It's always nice to have a friendly face around," he said. "Don't hesitate to knock if you need anything." Over the next few weeks, Jake became a constant presence in my life. He was always there when I left for work in the morning, conveniently taking out his trash or checking his mail. He'd wave and strike up a conversation, asking about my day or commenting on the weather. At first, I found it comforting being new to the city. It was nice to have someone to talk to, but slowly things began to change. Jake started showing up at my door more frequently, always with some excuse. He needed to borrow sugar, or he was locked out of his apartment, or he just wanted to see how I was settling, and his visits grew longer, and I found it increasingly difficult to politely end our conversations. I started noticing other things too. Sometimes, when I came home from work, things in my apartment would be slightly out of place. A book moved on the shelf, a cup in the sink I didn't remember using. I tried to convince myself I was just being forgetful, stressed for my new job and the move, but then came the night. I woke up to the sound of my front door closing. I lay there frozen in fear, straining my ears for any sound of an intruder. After what felt like hours, I finally worked up the courage to check. The apartment was empty, the door locked, but there on my coffee table was a single red rose. The next morning, Jake caught me in the hallway asleep while he asked, his eyes searching my face intently. "I thought I heard some noise from your place last night, wanted to check on you, but I figured you might be asleep." My blood ran cold. I mumbled something about having trouble sleeping and practically ran to my car. The day at work, I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying Jake's words, the rose on my coffee table, the feeling of wrongness that had been growing for weeks. I decided to talk to the building manager. Surely if Jake had a key to my apartment or was entering illegally, they'd want to know. But when I described my concerns, the manager looked. "I'm sorry," he said, "but there's no tenant named Jake in the building. The apartment next to yours has been empty for months." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. How is this possible? I'd seen Jake almost every day. We'd talked, shared meals. He'd been in my apartment. In a daze, I drove home, my mind racing. Had I imagined it all? Was I having some kind of breakdown? But as I parked my car, I saw him. Jake was standing by the building entrance, smiling. and waving as if nothing was wrong. I hurried past him, ignoring his greeting, and locked myself in my apartment. With shaking hands, I called the police. I told them everything about Jake, about the rose, about what the building manager had said. They promised to send someone to check it out. As I waited, I paced my apartment, jumping at every sound. The knock, when it came, made me nearly leap out of my skin. But it was the police, 2 officers, looking stern and professional. They listened to my story again, then asked to speak with Jake. I led them to his apartment, my heart pounding. But when we knocked, an elderly woman answered the door. She'd lived there for years. She told the confused officers she'd never heard of anyone named Jake. The police were sympathetic, but skeptical. They suggested I might be under too much stress, that perhaps I should see a doctor. They left me with a card for a local counseling service and a promise to keep an eye on the building. I spent the night at a friend's place, too scared to stay in my apartment, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The next evening, I reluctantly returned home. The building seemed quiet, normal, no sign of Jake. I double-checked all my locks, then took a long hot shower, trying to wash away the stress and fear of the past few days. As I stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, I froze there. Sitting on my bed was Jake. I was worried about you, he said, his voice soft. You seemed upset yesterday. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. How had he gotten? And how was he here when everyone said he didn't exist? You're not real, I whispered, my voice shaking. You can't be real. Jake's smile faltered, then returned wider. And somehow wrong. Oh, I'm very real, he said, standing up. More real than you know. And we have so much to talk about. I ran. I didn't stop to grab clothes or my phone. I just ran out of my apartment, down the stairs, and into the street. I ran until my lungs burned and my bare feet ached from the pavement. I ended up at the police station, hysterical and half naked. They took my statement, again sent officers to my apartment. But of course they found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there. I couldn't go back. I stayed with friends, then family. I quit my job, moved to a new city. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that Jake is out there watching, waiting. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of a familiar face in a crowd, or hear a laugh that makes my blood run cold. I don't know who or what Jake really was, a ghost, a figment of my imagination, some kind of supernatural entity. All I know is that he invaded my life, my home, my sanity. And even now, years later, I still check the locks 3 times before I go to bed. I still wake up in the middle of the night, certain I've heard my front door closing, because the truth is the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that hide under our beds or in our closets. They're the ones that smile at us in the hallway, that offer to help carry our groceries, that worm their way into our lives until we can't imagine them not being there. And by the time we realize the danger, it's often too late. So, if you ever meet a new neighbor who seems just a little too friendly, who always seems to be around when you come and go, who knows just a little too much about your life, be careful, set boundaries, trust your instincts, because you never know when the person next door out to be something much more sinister than just a nosy neighbor. And whatever you do, don't invite them in, because once they're inside, it might be impossible to get them out again. The sound of it zipper slowly opening my tent in the dead of night froze the blood in my veins. I lay there paralyzed with fear as the realization hit me. The footsteps I'd been hearing for the past 2 nights weren't just my imagination. Someone or something had finally decided to make its move. I've always been an avid camper. There's something about the solitude of nature, the challenge of surviving with just the basics, that's always called to me. This particular trip was supposed to be a chance to clear my head after a brutal breakup. 5 days, just me and the wilderness. No cell phone, no internet, no distractions, just the forest, the stars, and my thoughts. The first day had been perfect. I'd hiked deep into the backcountry setting up camp in a small clearing near a babbling brook. As I sat by my campfire that night watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the forest, I felt more at peace than I had in months. It was on the second day that things started to feel off. I'd spent the morning exploring the area around my campsite, taking in the beauty of the ancient trees and the melodic songs of the birds. But as I made my way back to my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off. After all, in the forest, you're never truly alone. There are always animals around, hidden in the undergrowth or perched in the trees. But this felt different, more intentional, more focused. That night as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard it for the first time, footsteps slow and deliberate circling my tent. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, curious about the strange nylon structure in their forest. But animals don't circle. They don't pace with such purpose. I held my breath, straining my ears to track the movement. The footsteps made a complete circuit around my tent before fading away into the darkness. I barely slept that night, jerking awake at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. The third day dawned bright and clear, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I thought about packing up and heading back to civilization, but something held me back. Pride, maybe, or the stubborn belief that I was just letting my imagination run wild. I spent the day close to camp, unable to muster the enthusiasm for another hike. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, the forest seemed to grow unnaturally quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. It was as if the entire wood was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I built my fire larger than usual that night, hoping the flames would keep at bay whatever was lurking in the darkness. But as I sat there, the flickering light seemed to make the shadows dance and twist in unsettling ways. More than once, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing just at the edge of the firelight, watching me. But whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with unsettling dreams. I woke several times, each time certain I'd heard those footsteps again, circling, always circling. But the sounds always faded as soon as I became fully conscious. It was in the deepest part of the night that it happened. I was jolted from a restless sleep by a sound I'd been dreading, the slow, deliberate tread of footsteps approaching my tent. This time, they didn't circle. They came directly to the entrance and stopped for a long moment. There was nothing but silence. I lay there, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it must be audible, hardly daring to breathe. Then, ever so slowly, I heard the zipper of my tent begin to move. Panic surged through me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, watching in horror as the entrance to my tent inched open. A shape appeared in the opening, darker than the night beyond. I couldn't make out any features, just a vague humanoid form blocking out the stars. As it began to enter the tent, I finally found my voice and let out a teary-eyed yell. The figure paused, then withdrew. I heard those footsteps again, quickly retreating into the forest. Without thinking, I lunged for my flashlight and burst out of the tent, desperate to see what had been stalking me. The beam of my light cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and underbrush. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then a movement caught my eye. Something large was moving through the forest. Just at the edge of my light's reach, I caught a glimpse of pale, elongated limbs, a body too tall and thin to be human. Then it was gone, melting into the shadows between the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat with my back against a tree, flashlight in one hand and my camping knife in the other, jumping at every sound. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my camp with shaking hands and practically ran back to the trailhead. It wasn't until I was in my car driving back toward civilization that I allowed myself to really think about what had happened, what had been out there in the woods, what did it want. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it away, a bear maybe, or just my imagination running wild in the solitude of the forest. But deep down I knew better. Whatever had visited my camp that night wasn't anything natural. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me. I threw myself into work, into socializing, into anything that would keep my mind occupied. But at night, when everything was quiet, I'd find myself straining my ears, half expecting to hear those slow, deliberate footsteps circling my bedroom. I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. When I finally did work up the courage, I made sure to go with a group to stay in designated campgrounds with other people around. But even then, I'd lie awake at night listening, always listening. It's been years now since that solo camping trip, but I still can't shake the memory of those 3 nights in there. Would sometimes when I'm hiking or even just walking in a park, I'll get a prickle on the back of my neck, a certainty that I'm being watched. I'll spin around, half expecting to see that tall, pale figure behind a tree. There's never anything there, of course, at least nothing I can see. I've done research since then, looking into folklore and myths about forest creatures. I found stories from all over the world about entities that stalk lone travelers in the wilderness. Some accounts describe them as protectors of nature, others as malevolent spirits that feed on fear. I don't know which, if any, of these stories might explain what I encountered. What I do know is this: the wilderness, for all its beauty, holds secrets. There are things out there in the deep woods, in the places where humans rarely tread, that defy explanation, things that watch and wait, that test the boundaries between their world and ours. I still love nature. I still hike and camp when I can, but I'm more cautious now, more aware. I pay attention to the sounds of the forest, to the way the birds and animals behave. And if things ever get too quiet, if I ever get that feeling of being watched, like and subscribe for 4